Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something. If you enjoy what you're about to hear, please consider using those hype points on this video. It really helps the channel more than you possibly know, and it keeps stories like this one coming. Also, if you want to, drop a comment telling us what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's incredible to know this community spans the entire globe. And a massive thank you to Amber for suggesting tonight's story. This one's a deep dive, and it all started with your recommendation. Now, let's begin. The Northwoods files. The plan. They never burned. Imagine finding a document that was never supposed to exist. A carbon copy of something so disturbing, so carefully orchestrated, that even after it was supposedly declassified, 6 pages remained hidden. 6 pages that suggest the most controversial false flag operation in American history didn't die when the president rejected it. 6 pages that imply it simply went underground, evolved, and became the foundation for something far more sinister. This is the story of Operation Northwoods, but not the version you might have heard about. This is about what happened after the plan was rejected. This is about the pages that vanished. This is about a researcher who found them and then disappeared himself. This is about the possibility that Northwoods never really ended at all. The page that should have been shredded May 1998. College Park, Maryland, the National Archives. 2 building sits like a fortress of secrets. Its climate-controlled vaults holding millions of documents that chronicle the hidden machinery of American power. Most researchers who walk through its doors are academics, historians, graduate students chasing footnotes for dissertations that 3 people will ever read. Daniel Reeves was different. He had been coming to the archives for 6 months, systematically working through declassified intelligence files from the Cold War. He had a theory, one that most of his colleagues dismissed as paranoid speculation. Daniel believed that the government's covert operations against Cuba in the early 60s had left a paper trail that told a very different story than the official narrative. He believed that some operations approved at the highest levels had been deliberately obscured, their true scope hidden even in declassified materials. His colleagues thought he was wasting his time. They were wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of grey spring day where rain threatens but never quite arrives. Daniel sat at his usual desk in the research room, surrounded by file boxes containing Pentagon budget documents from 1962. Tedious material, page after page of appropriations, personnel transfers, equipment requisitions. The kind of bureaucratic minutiae that makes most people's eyes glaze over. Daniel loved it. Because sometimes, in the margins of budget reports and personnel files, you found things that were never meant to be found. He was halfway through a box labelled Pentagon-1962 Budget Amendments when he noticed something odd. The folder tabs were colour-coded by month, a standard archival practice. But one folder near the back had the wrong colour tab. It was filed as if it belonged to March, but the tab was blue instead of green. Daniel pulled it out. The label read, Contingency Planning - Cuba Operations - March through August 62. That wasn't a budget document. His pulse quickened as he opened the folder. Inside were approximately 40 pages, some typed on official Department of Defense letterhead, others appearing to be carbon copies, made on that distinctive onion skin paper that government offices used back then. The pages smelled like old basements and secrets. The first page was familiar. He recognised it immediately because he had seen it before, in a different context, years earlier. It was the cover memo of Operation Northwoods. Most people with even a passing interest in conspiracy theories know about Operation Northwoods. It was declassified in 1997 by the Assassination Records Review Board as part of the JFK Files release. The basic facts are not in dispute. In March of 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff drafted a proposal for false flag terrorist operations to be conducted against American civilians and military targets, then blamed on Cuba to justify a military invasion. The proposal was insane. It suggested hijacking planes, bombing American cities, staging funerals for fake victims, even sinking American ships and blaming Castro. It was signed by every member of the Joint Chiefs. It was delivered to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara on March 13, 1962, and President Kennedy rejected it almost immediately. That's where the official story ends. The plan was too extreme, too immoral, too risky. Kennedy said no, and Northwoods was filed away as a historical curiosity. Proof that even in the fevered atmosphere of the Cold War, there were lines the government would not cross. Daniel had read the declassified Northwoods memo multiple times. It was 15 pages long, single-spaced, dense with bureaucratic language that barely concealed its horrifying implications. But the document in his hands was not 15 pages long. It was 21 pages. He felt a cold sensation spreading through his chest as he flipped through the pages. The first 15 were identical to the declassified version. He recognized specific paragraphs, particular turns of phrase, but then came page 16, and the document continued into territory he had never seen before. Page 16 was titled Addendum-Contingency Patterns, Alpha through Gamma. Daniel's hands were shaking now. He pulled out his phone to take photographs, then remembered that cameras were not permitted in this section of the archives. He would have to read it here, memorize what he could, and request official copies through the proper channels. He began reading. Contingency Pattern Alpha was outlined first. It elaborated on the hijacking scenarios mentioned in the main memo, but with far more detail. Specific airlines were named. Particular routes were suggested. There were contingencies for media coverage, instructions for coordinating with cleared journalists to ensure the story was reported in specific ways. Cleared journalists. Daniel underlined the phrase in his mind. Pattern Beta expanded on the fake funeral concept, but again with disturbing specificity. It discussed the psychological impact of televised grief, the importance of victim narratives in shaping public opinion, the ways that emotional trauma could be channeled into political support for military action. Then came Pattern Gamma. The heading read, Psychological Continuity Operation Gamma Framework. The language shifted here. It became more abstract, more theoretical. It referenced academic research on mass psychology, studies on propaganda effectiveness, analyses of how populations respond to fear. There were citations to RAND Corporation reports, references to research conducted at major universities. And then, halfway down page 18, Daniel found the sentence that made his stomach drop. Gamma Activation Protocol. Implement only upon presidential refusal of primary operations. Gamma represents long-term strategic alternative to direct action, focusing on gradual conditioning rather than immediate provocation. Daniel read it again. Then a third time. Gamma was not an alternative to Northwoods. It was what happened if Northwoods was rejected. It was Plan B. The next 2 pages outlined Gamma in more detail. It described a multi-year program of perception management and narrative conditioning. It suggested using media assets to gradually shift public opinion, creating a climate where military intervention in Cuba would eventually become politically inevitable, even without a specific triggering incident. It talked about cooperative elements in news organizations, entertainment media, and academia. It referenced ongoing programs already in place, suggesting that some form of this operation was already active even as the Northwoods memo was being drafted. And then, on page 20, Daniel found the signatures. Every member of the Joint Chiefs had signed, just as they had on the main Northwoods memo. But on this version, there was an additional line below their signatures. It read, Presidential Authorization, blank date, March 1662. Someone had drawn a line through this blank space and written a single word in pen, declined. But the handwriting looked wrong. Daniel had seen Kennedy's signature dozens of times in various documents. The slant was different. The pressure of the pen was too heavy. The letter forms did not quite match. He flipped to the final page, page 21. It was a memo dated March 23rd, 1962, 9 days after the Northwoods memo was delivered to McNamara. It was from the office of General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and it was addressed to a list of approximately 15 recipients whose names had been blacked out with marker. The text was brief. Presidential rejection of primary operations confirmed. Proceed with implementation of Gamma framework as outlined in addendum. Maintain operational security at highest level. All coordinating materials to be removed from official channels and transferred to designated secure storage. Anticipate minimum 5-year timeline for full effectiveness. Daniel sat back in his chair, his mind racing. If this document was authentic, it meant that after Kennedy rejected Operation Northwoods, the Joint Chiefs did not simply abandon the plan. They activated a backup operation designed to achieve the same goal through psychological manipulation instead of direct action. And they did it without presidential approval. He checked his watch. The archives closed in an hour. He needed to make copies of this file, but the standard procedure required submitting a formal request that could take weeks to process. By then, if someone realised this document was not supposed to be accessible, it might disappear. He stood up and walked to the reference desk, carrying the folder. A supervisor he had worked with before, a woman named Patricia Ellison, was reviewing some paperwork behind the counter. "Patricia, I need to request copies of this entire folder. It's from the Cuba Operations Collection, March 62. Patricia took the folder and glanced at the label. Her expression changed immediately. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around her eyes, but Daniel caught it. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "It was in box 17 of the Pentagon budget series. It was misfiled, I think." Patricia opened the folder and flipped through the pages. Her face went carefully neutral. "I need to verify something. Can you wait here for a moment?" She disappeared into the back offices, taking the folder with her. Daniel waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. He felt a growing unease that he could not quite explain. When Patricia returned, she did not have the folder. Her expression was professional, but cold. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reeves. That folder contains materials that are still under review. It was not supposed to be in the open collection. I cannot process a copy request at this time." But it was in the declassified section. The box was clearly marked as available for research. Nevertheless, the folder itself contains restricted materials. I've notified the appropriate department. The issue will be corrected. Can you at least tell me what the restriction is based on? The main Northwoods memo was fully declassified in 97. Patricia's expression did not change. "I cannot comment on the classification status of materials I have not been authorized to discuss. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" The message was clear. This conversation was over. Daniel left the archives that afternoon feeling like he had touched something he was never meant to see. He spent the evening writing down everything he could remember from those 6 additional pages, filling a dozen notebook pages with details while they were still fresh in his mind. The next morning he returned to the archives. He went straight to box 17 of the Pentagon budget series and searched for the blue-tabbed folder. It was gone. Patricia was not at the reference desk. He asked another employee about her and was told she had the day off. He requested box 17 again and went through it page by page. The budget documents were still there, but the folder on Cuba operations had vanished completely. It was as if it had never existed at all. But Daniel Reeves knew what he had seen, and he knew that someone had not wanted him to see it. So he began to dig deeper. The real history. To understand what Daniel had stumbled onto, you need to understand the actual history of Operation Northwoods. And the thing about Northwoods is that the basic facts are not disputed. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented, verified, historical reality. Let's start at the beginning. On January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces took control of Cuba, overthrowing the Batista regime that had been friendly to American interests. Within months, the relationship between the United States and Cuba deteriorated rapidly. Castro nationalized American-owned properties, aligned himself with the Soviet Union, and transformed Cuba into a communist state just 90 miles from Florida. The American government, particularly the CIA and the Pentagon, became obsessed with removing Castro. The obsession was not just ideological. Cuba's proximity to the United States, combined with its alliance with the Soviets, represented a genuine strategic threat in the context of the Cold War. The first major attempt to remove Castro came in April 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion. A CIA-trained force of Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast, intending to spark a popular uprising against Castro. The operation was an absolute disaster. The invasion force was defeated within 3 days. More than 100 invaders were killed and over 1,000 were captured. The failure humiliated the CIA, embarrassed President Kennedy, and strengthened Castro's position. But rather than deterring further action, the Bay of Pigs failure made certain elements within the American military and intelligence establishment more determined than ever to bring Castro down. This is where Operation Northwoods enters the picture. In February 1962, General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, authorized the creation of a proposal for covert operations designed to justify American military intervention in Cuba. The task was given to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, particularly Brigadier General William Craig, who headed up the Cuba project within the Pentagon. The result was a document officially titled Justification for United States Military Intervention in Cuba, but which became known as Operation Northwoods. The memo was delivered to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara on March 13, 1962. It was signed by every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff: General Lemnitzer, General George Decker of the Army, Admiral George Anderson of the Navy, General Curtis LeMay of the Air Force, and General David Shoup of the Marine Corps. The proposals contained in that memo remain shocking even today, more than 60 years later. The Joint Chiefs suggested staging terrorist attacks against American civilians and military targets, then blaming those attacks on Cuba to create public support for an invasion. The specific proposals included starting rumours about Cuban sabotage using clandestine radio broadcasts, landing friendly Cubans in uniform inside Cuba, then claiming they were victims of Cuban aggression, creating incidents at Guantanamo Bay, including staging attacks on the base and creating fake casualties, developing a terror campaign in Miami and other Florida cities, with bombings and acts of violence blamed on Cuban agents, sinking a boatload of Cuban refugees en route to Florida, real or simulated, staging a fake attack on a civilian aircraft with passengers using aliases to create the appearance that Cuba had shot down an American plane, creating a fake incident where a commercial airliner appeared to be attacked by Cuban forces while flying near Cuba, using a duplicate aircraft to create the illusion. These were not vague suggestions. The memo included detailed planning, specific scenarios, and recommendations for how to manage the media coverage to ensure maximum public impact. The language of the document is clinical, bureaucratic, almost casual in its discussion of false flag terrorism. One passage reads, "We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. Real or simulated." As if the difference were merely a technical detail, another section suggests, "It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States. The destination would be chosen only to heighten the credibility of the operation and create the impression of rash Cuban rashness." When you read the actual document, what strikes you is not just the immorality of the proposals, but the matter-of-fact tone. These were serious military leaders discussing terrorist attacks on their own citizens, the way someone might discuss logistical planning for a supply convoy. President Kennedy's response to the Northwoods proposal was swift and definitive. He rejected it. There is no record of any serious consideration given to implementing the plan. Kennedy had already been burned by the Bay of Pigs debacle, and he was deeply skeptical of the aggressive military solutions being pushed by the Pentagon and the CIA. In August of 1962, just 5 months after the Northwoods memo was delivered, General Lemnitzer was removed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He was reassigned to be the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. a prestigious position, but one that effectively removed him from direct influence over Cuba policy. The official story says that this was the end of Operation Northwoods. Kennedy said no, Lemnitzer was sidelined, and the plan was filed away as a historical artifact. Except Daniel Reeves had found evidence that suggested a very different story. The part no one acknowledges. Daniel spent the next 3 weeks systematically searching for any other references to Contingency Gamma, or the extended version of the Northwoods memo. He worked his way through related collections at the archives, requested files from the JFK Presidential Library, and contacted researchers who specialized in Cold War covert operations. He found nothing. Or rather, he found absences where something should have been. Several files related to Cuba operations from March through August 1962 were listed in the archive's catalogue but marked as unavailable for research purposes. When Daniel requested information about why they were restricted, he received vague responses about ongoing classification review or materials not yet processed. This was unusual. The Assassination Records Review Board had conducted a massive declassification effort in the mid-90s, specifically focused on materials related to Cuba, the CIA, and Kennedy's assassination. Most relevant files from that era had been declassified and made available. The fact that certain files were still restricted decades later suggested someone had a specific reason for keeping them sealed. Daniel also discovered something odd about the declassification of the main Northwoods memo itself. While it had been released in 1997 as part of the JFK files, the memo's existence had actually been revealed much earlier. In a 1994 book by James Bamford about the National Security Agency, Northwoods was briefly mentioned as an example of rejected covert operation proposals. But Bamford's description of the memo included details that did not appear in the later declassified version. He mentioned multi-phase implementation strategies and psychological operations, components that were supposedly part of the Northwoods proposal. When the actual memo was declassified 3 years later, those elements were not present. Daniel tracked down Bamford's contact information and sent him an email explaining what he had found. Bamford responded within a day, and they arranged a phone call. "I remember those details," Bamford said when Daniel asked about the discrepancies. "I saw a summary of Northwoods in a different document, something from the NSA's files about Cuba operations. It mentioned that Northwoods had multiple components, including some kind of media coordination plan and a long-term psychological operation." "Did you ever see the full document?" Daniel asked. "No, just summaries and references in other materials. I assumed everything was in the main memo when it was declassified. But if you're saying there were additional pages," Bamford trailed off, "that would explain some things." "Like what?" "Like why McNamara was always so evasive when asked about Northwoods. He gave testimony about it in the 90s, but he refused to discuss certain aspects. He kept saying some elements were not appropriate for public discussion, or were still classified for national security reasons. I always wondered what he meant." Daniel felt a surge of validation. He was not imagining things. The evidence suggested that there was indeed more to Operation Northwoods than the public had been allowed to see. He began searching for records of Robert McNamara's testimony about Northwoods. In November 1995, McNamara had been interviewed by the Assassination Records Review Board as part of their investigation. A transcript of that interview existed, and Daniel was able to access it through a FOIA request. Most of the interview was straightforward. McNamara confirmed receiving the Northwoods memo, described his reaction to it as appalled, and stated that he had never seriously considered implementing any of its proposals. He said he had briefed President Kennedy on the memo and that Kennedy had rejected it immediately. But then, on page 47 of the transcript, there was this exchange. Interviewer: "Were there any other components to the Northwoods proposal beyond the specific operations described in the main memo, McNamara? I cannot discuss certain aspects of the proposal that remain classified." Interviewer: "The memo itself has been declassified. Are you saying there are parts of it that are still sealed?" McNamara: "I am saying that there were related materials and discussions that I am not authorized to address." Interviewer: "Can you at least tell us the general nature of these materials?" McNamara: "They dealt with alternative approaches. Contingency planning, that is all I can say." The interviewer had pressed further, but McNamara refused to elaborate. The transcript showed him becoming increasingly uncomfortable, eventually stating flatly that he would not discuss that section of the operation regardless of what questions were asked. That section. As if there was a specific, defined portion of Northwoods that remained off limits, even in a closed-door interview with government investigators. Daniel made a note. McNamara knew about the addendum. He'd seen the extra pages, and he had been ordered to keep them secret. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Daniel had posted a query on an online forum used by researchers who specialised in declassified intelligence documents. He asked if anyone had encountered references to contingency gamma, or gamma framework, in Cold War-era files. 2 days later, he received a private message from someone using the username Mongoose77. The message was brief. "You're looking at Operation Mongoose. Check the cross-references. Item P5 and P6. They redacted the relevant sections, but the references are still there." Operation Mongoose was the CIA's covert sabotage program against Cuba, launched in November 1961 after the Bay of Pigs failure. It was run by Edward Lansdale, a legendary CIA operative, and it involved everything from economic sabotage to assassination attempts against Castro. Mongoose was real, documented, and had been extensively studied. Daniel went back through the declassified Mongoose files. The operation had multiple components, coded as P items. P1 dealt with sabotage of Cuban industrial facilities. P2 focused on infiltrating exile groups into Cuba. P3 and P4 covered various propaganda and intelligence gathering operations. P5 and P6 were listed in the operations index, but the actual content for both items was completely redacted. Page after page of black bars with only occasional phrases visible. Daniel could make out fragmentary references. Domestic perception, coordinated messaging, cleared media assets, narrative alignment. These were not sabotage operations. These were not about Cuba at all. They were about managing American public opinion. He found a notation at the bottom of one heavily redacted page. See also, J Chief's Contingency Planning, March 62, August 62. There it was, the direct connection between Operation Mongoose and the time frame, when Northwoods was drafted and rejected. P5 and P6 of Mongoose appeared to be linked to the Joint Chiefs Contingency Planning, from the exact period when the Northwoods Addendum would have been created. Daniel needed to find someone who had actually worked on Mongoose, someone who might know what P5 and P6 really were. It took him 3 months, but he finally located a former CIA analyst named Thomas Whitaker, who had worked under Lansdale during the Mongoose operation. Whitaker was in his 80s now, living in Northern Virginia, and he was willing to talk as long as Daniel promised not to record the conversation or publish anything that could be traced back to him. They met at a diner off Interstate 66 on a Sunday morning in October. Whitaker was thin, sharp-eyed, and immediately made clear that he would only discuss certain topics. "I worked on propaganda materials," Whitaker said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Radio broadcasts, leaflets, that kind of thing. Mongoose was mostly about making Castro's life difficult, but there were other components." "P5 and P6, Daniel said. Whitaker's expression did not change, but his hand stopped moving for just a moment. "You have done your homework." "What were they?" "Officially, domestic public affairs coordination. That was the bland language they used, but what it really meant was managing how Americans perceived the Cuba situation. Lansdale worked with people in the Pentagon, people in the media. The idea was to create a consistent narrative, make sure that when something happened with Cuba, the American public would interpret it the right way. The right way meaning favourably toward intervention. Exactly. It was not about making stuff up necessarily. It was about emphasis. Which stories got covered, which experts got quoted, which angles got pursued. We had journalists who would cooperate, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. We had academics who would publish papers supporting our position. We had people in Hollywood working on projects that would portray Cuba in certain ways. Daniel felt his pulse quickening. Did this have anything to do with Operation Northwoods? Whitaker sipped his coffee before answering. Northwoods was the Joint Chiefs baby, not ours. But yeah, There was overlap. After Kennedy killed Northwoods, some of the same thinking migrated over to Mongoose. The idea that you did not need a big dramatic incident to get public support. You could build it gradually, shape perception over time. Someone once told me that Northwoods was not really about Cuba, Daniel said carefully. They said it was about learning how far you could bend the American mind. Whittaker met his eyes for a long moment. Then he looked down at his coffee. Whoever told you that understood the real game. Cuba was the excuse. The actual experiment was whether you could manufacture public consent for just about anything, if you controlled the narrative. And the answer, we discovered, was yes. You absolutely could. The conspiracy twist. Daniel's research had taken him from a misfiled folder in the archives to a disturbing conclusion. Operation Northwoods had not died when Kennedy rejected it. The specific proposals for false flag terrorism had been shelved, but the underlying concept, the Gamma framework, had been implemented through other channels. But the story went deeper than that, and darker. Daniel found the next piece in one of the most unlikely places. A half-destroyed file pulled from a private document collection being donated to a library in Baltimore. The collection had belonged to a retired Department of Defense analyst who had passed away. His family was sorting through boxes of old papers, most of them routine bureaucratic materials, when they found a folder marked Northwoods-related -personal notes. The family donated the collection to a local university library, and Daniel only learned about it because he had set up automated alerts for any new archival materials mentioning Northwoods. He drove to Baltimore the day after the collection was processed and spent an afternoon going through the dead analyst's papers. Most of it was exactly what you would expect: memos, reports, meeting notes. But tucked into a folder about budget hearings from 1962 was a single page that appeared to have survived a fire. The edges were burned, the paper was brittle, and perhaps 1/3 of the text was missing. What remained was enough to make Daniel's hand shake. The document appeared to be from the Office of Naval Intelligence, dated June 1962. The top half was mostly burned away, but the bottom section was partially readable. It contained a list of names, approximately 20 of them, with notations beside each one. The names included journalists from CBS, ABC, the Miami Herald, the Washington Post, and several other major news organizations. Next to each name was a phrase: verified cooperative, cleared for contingency Gamma operations. Some of these journalists, Daniel realized with growing shock, had gone on to become extremely prominent in American media. Network anchors, editorial boards, people whose reporting had shaped how millions of Americans understood major events for decades. And in 1962 they had apparently been identified as cooperative with a Pentagon psychological operation. Daniel photographed the damaged document with trembling hands. He spent the next week trying to verify its authenticity, consulting paper experts and handwriting analysts. The paper was consistent with ONI documents from that era. The typewriter font matched those used in government offices in the early 60s. The document appeared to be genuine, but what did it mean? Had these journalists knowingly cooperated with a government propaganda operation? Or had they simply been identified as people whose reporting tended to align with Pentagon preferences? Either way, the implications were staggering. Daniel found another connection in the most disturbing place possible: a fire report from October 1962. A CIA safe house in northwest Washington, used for operations related to Cuba, had burned in what was officially ruled an electrical malfunction. The fire destroyed most of the documents stored there, which officially included operational planning materials related to Cuban exile coordination. But Daniel found a letter in the State Department archives from a CIA logistics officer complaining about the fire. The letter mentioned that materials related to Gamma psychological programming had been lost in the blaze and would need to be recreated from backup copies held elsewhere. Gamma psychological programming, there was that word again. The fire happened in October 1962, 7 months after Kennedy rejected Northwoods, 5 months after Lemnitzer was removed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. If Gamma had been killed along with the rest of Northwoods, why would there be materials about it in an active CIA safe house months later? And why would those materials need to be recreated? Daniel pulled Federal Aviation Administration records from 1963, looking for anything unusual. He found 2 incidents that made his blood freeze. In April 1963, the FAA recorded what was described as a fabricated hijack transmission test. According to the incident report, a military aircraft had broadcast a fake distress call claiming to be a hijacked civilian plane. The test was allegedly part of emergency response protocols, but the specific phrasing in the report was almost identical to language in the Northwoods memo about simulating hijacking incidents. In July 1963, the FAA recorded a controlled civilian panic response drill at Miami International Airport. Again, the report described it as a training exercise, but the scenario involved simulating a Cuban attack on a commercial aircraft and measuring how passengers and airport personnel would respond. These were not random drills. These were simulations of the exact scenarios described in Operation Northwoods. Why would the military and FAA be running drills based on a plan that Kennedy had supposedly killed more than a year earlier? Unless parts of Northwoods, particularly the Gamma framework, had never actually been killed at all. Daniel began digging into what happened to General Lemnitzer after he was reassigned to NATO. Official history has portrayed this as a standard rotation, a prestigious assignment. But Daniel found internal memos suggesting that Lemnitzer had continued to meet with CIA officials about Cuba policy even after leaving his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. In September 1962, Lemnitzer met with CIA Deputy Director Marshall Carter. In October, he met with Richard Helms, then in charge of the CIA's Covert Operations Division. In November 1962, he attended a meeting at CIA headquarters in Langley with several Joint Chiefs staff officers and senior CIA officials. The meetings were logged, but the subjects were not recorded. They were classified under a special category that even decades later remained partially sealed. Why was a general who had supposedly been sidelined for pushing an extreme covert operation continuing to meet with the CIA about Cuba? What were they discussing in those meetings? Daniel found a partial answer in a collection of personal papers donated by a retired Air Force colonel who had served on the Joint Chiefs staff. Among routine correspondence was a memo from December 1962, marked Eyes Only from Lemnitzer to a small group of recipients. The memo read, "Gamma implementation proceeding as planned despite presidential obstruction. Mongoose coordination effective. Estimate 12 to 18 months for full domestic narrative shift. Cuban crisis provides excellent testing ground for perception management techniques. Domestic narrative shift. Perception management techniques. They had not abandoned the Gamma framework. They were actively implementing it without presidential authorization." And then Daniel found the connection that researchers had whispered about for decades but could never quite prove. The Dallas connection. In 1976, a former CIA officer named Victor Marchetti published an article about the Kennedy assassination that included a provocative statement. Marchetti wrote, "A rare discussion of assassination at high levels came about in response to allegations by a Pentagon officer. The story was investigated by the CIA, and by the time we were through, we were convinced there was nothing to it. But the story is still fascinating. The gist of the story was that the officer said President Kennedy was killed by elements within the government. Years later, in an interview, Marchetti elaborated slightly. I cannot prove anything, but I can tell you that if you investigate Operation Northwoods deeply enough, all roads eventually lead to Dallas." It was a cryptic statement, and Marchetti had never provided any concrete evidence. Most researchers dismissed it as speculative conspiracy thinking. But Daniel could not stop thinking about the timeline. March 1962, Kennedy rejects Operation Northwoods. August 1962, Lemnitzer is removed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. October 1962, materials related to Gamma framework are referenced in an active CIA safe house. November 1963, President Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. It proved nothing. Correlation is not causation. But the pattern was unsettling, especially given what Daniel had learned about Gamma's implementation continuing despite presidential rejection. he found something else in the archives that made the timeline even more disturbing. In September 1963, just 2 months before Kennedy's assassination, the Joint Chiefs held a special meeting about Cuba policy. The meeting was attended by all the chiefs, plus several Pentagon officials and 2 representatives from the CIA. The minutes from that meeting were mostly declassified, but one section remained redacted. All Daniel could see was discussion of contingency planning for post-Castro scenario, reference to redacted implementation strategies from March 62 planning documents. March 62 was when Northwoods was drafted. Post-Castro scenario suggested planning for what would happen after Castro was removed from power. But why would they be referencing planning documents from March 62 unless those documents contained strategies that were still considered relevant? Daniel found one more piece, and this one chilled him to the bone. In the National Security Archive, a collection of declassified documents at George Washington University, there was a memo from McGeorge Bundy, Kennedy's National Security Advisor, to the President dated October 1963. The memo was brief. Mr. President, per your inquiry about ongoing Cuba operations, I have confirmed that certain military planning activities continue without NSC oversight. I recommend immediate review and possible intervention. Kennedy died less than a month later. There is no record that any review was ever conducted. What military planning activities was Bundy referring to? Why were they operating without NSC oversight? And why did Kennedy apparently only learn about them in October 1963? Daniel could not prove it, but the evidence suggested a disturbing possibility. After Kennedy rejected Northwoods and removed Lemnitzer, certain elements within the military and intelligence establishment continued implementing parts of the plan, particularly the Gamma Psychological Operations Framework, without presidential knowledge or approval. They had decided that manufacturing public consent for Cuba policy was too important to let something like presidential authority get in the way. And when Kennedy started asking questions about unauthorized operations in the weeks before his death, Daniel did not want to finish that thought. But he could not stop thinking about Victor Marchetti's words, all roads eventually lead to Dallas. The modern version. Daniel's investigation had taken him from 1962 to 1963, tracing how Operation Northwoods appeared to evolve from a rejected proposal into an active psychological operation. But the story did not end there. In fact, it might not have ended at all. In December 2001, Daniel received an anonymous email. The sender used an obviously fake name and an encrypted email service. The message contained no text, just an attachment, a scanned PDF of what appeared to be a government memo. Daniel ran every security check he could think of before opening it. The PDF was clean. What it contained was explosive. The document was dated September 2002, 1 year after the September 11th attacks. It appeared to be from an office within the Department of Defense called Strategic Communications and Information Operations. The memo was addressed to multiple recipients whose names were redacted. The subject line read, Gamma Continuity - Narrative Alignment Protocols. There was that word again. Gamma. The memo discussed perception management strategies for maintaining public support for military operations. It talked about cooperative media relationships, academic outreach programs, and entertainment industry coordination. It mentioned emotional event design and behavioral priming. The language was more sophisticated than the 1962 documents, more dressed up in social science terminology. But the underlying concept was the same, systematically shaping how Americans perceived military and foreign policy issues. One section read, building on frameworks established during Cold War operations, particularly the Gamma protocols from Cuba planning, modern perception management can leverage digital media and real-time communication to achieve more rapid and comprehensive narrative adoption than previously possible. Building on frameworks established during Cold War operations, Gamma protocols from Cuba planning, they were openly referencing Northwoods-era techniques, updated for the 21st century. Daniel could not verify the document's authenticity. The sender never responded to his attempts at contact. But he began looking for other evidence that something like the Gamma framework might be operating in the modern era. He found it in unexpected places. In 2004, he discovered a Department of Defense contract with a private communications firm to provide strategic messaging coordination for the Iraq War. The contract mentioned embedding narrative frameworks in media coverage and coordinating expert commentary across multiple platforms. In 2008, he found National Security Council emails discussing perception management strategies for the financial crisis. The emails referenced controlled information releases and coordinating with cleared media contacts. In 2012, he found State Department documents about strategic communications for the Libyan intervention that used phrases almost identical to the 1962 Northwoods addendum. Psychological continuity, narrative conditioning, emotional framework establishment. The terminology had evolved. The techniques had become more sophisticated, but the basic approach, using coordinated psychological operations to shape domestic public opinion, appeared to be standard practice. Daniel began reaching out to people who might know more: Pentagon communications officers, retired CIA analysts, academics who studied propaganda and media manipulation. Most would not talk. A few would speak off the record, and they painted a disturbing picture. One former Pentagon official told Daniel, "Every administration does this. They call it different things: public affairs, strategic communications, information operations. But it is all the same basic playbook. You figure out what narrative you want the public to believe, and then you use every tool available to embed that narrative in the media environment. It is not a conspiracy. It is just how modern government works." A retired NSA analyst was more blunt. Northwoods was amateur hour compared to what we can do now. Back then they had to rely on a few journalists and radio broadcasts. Now we have social, media, algorithmic content promotion, coordinated influencer networks. We can shape perception at scale in ways those guys in the 60s could not have imagined. In 2014, Daniel found the most direct connection. He was reviewing FOIA requests related to the CIA's communications office when he came across a training manual for information operations officers. The manual was heavily redacted, but one section that remained visible was titled Historical Frameworks for Domestic Perception Management. It contained a case study. The case study was Operation Northwoods. The manual described Northwoods as an early attempt at comprehensive narrative control that failed due to operational exposure and political resistance. It then stated, modern operations benefit from lessons learned, particularly the importance of A. Maintaining operational security, B. Implementing gradual conditioning rather than dramatic events, C. Utilizing distributed influence networks rather than centralized control. It was Gamma, the exact approach described in the Northwoods addendum from 1962, and the CIA was teaching it as a case study for modern information operations. Daniel realized something chilling. Operation Northwoods had not been rejected. Not really. The specific proposals for false flag terrorism had been too extreme, too risky, too likely to be exposed. But the underlying concept, the Gamma framework for manipulating public perception, had been validated and refined over 6 decades. It had become standard procedure. Daniel's discovery and disappearance. By 2015, Daniel had compiled more than 2,000 pages of documents, memos, emails, and interviews, tracing the evolution of the Gamma framework from its origins in Operation Northwoods to its apparent modern implementation. He had built a comprehensive case that psychological operations for domestic perception management had been continuous government policy since at least the early 1960s. He decided to publish his findings. He contacted several journalists, offered his research to documentary filmmakers, and prepared a comprehensive report that could be released online. That is when things started to go wrong. In July 2015, Daniel's apartment was broken into. Nothing obvious was stolen. His television was still there. His laptop was still there. But his file cabinets had been opened and his documents had been disturbed. Someone had gone through his physical files. Fortunately, Daniel had anticipated something like this. All his important materials were backed up on encrypted drives stored in multiple locations. The break-in was unsettling, but not catastrophic. 2 weeks later, 2 men appeared at his door, claiming to be from something called the Department of Defense Records Integrity Program. They wore suits and carried identification that looked official. They said there had been concerns about improperly accessed materials from the National Archives, and they needed to verify that Daniel did not possess any classified documents. Daniel refused to let them in. He asked for their names and contact information so he could verify their credentials. They became insistent, saying they had legal authority to inspect his materials. Daniel told them to come back with a warrant. They left. Daniel immediately called the main Department of Defense information number and asked about the Records Integrity Program. After being transferred 3 times, he finally reached someone who told him no such program existed. He filed a police report about the incident, but nothing came of it. In September, Daniel finally finished compiling his research into a comprehensive document. It was more than 300 pages long, meticulously sourced, with scanned copies of key documents embedded throughout. He titled it, "Gamma Was Never About Cuba: How Operation Northwoods Became Standard American Policy." He planned to release it online on October 1st. He sent advance copies to several journalists and researchers. He encrypted the main file and prepared to upload it to multiple document sharing sites. On September 28th, Daniel uploaded a short preview to his personal website. The preview described his findings about the Northwoods addendum and mentioned that the full report would be available within days. The preview was online for approximately 6 hours before his website was taken down by what his hosting company described as a terms of service violation. They would not specify what terms he had violated. When he tried to contact them for clarification, his account had been suspended and his data was no longer accessible. Daniel had backups. He tried uploading the preview to other platforms. Within 24 hours, his accounts on 3 different document sharing sites were suspended. No explanation was given. On September 30th, the day before his planned full release, Daniel received an encrypted email from the same anonymous address that had sent him the 2002 memo years earlier. This time, there was a message. "They know what you have. They know what you plan to release. It will not be allowed. Recommend you reconsider. This is not a threat. This is a warning from someone who understands the system." Daniel did not reconsider. On the evening of September 30th, he uploaded encrypted copies of his full report to multiple servers, sent password-protected versions to more than 50 journalists and researchers, and posted the decryption key on several online forums. He went to sleep that night believing his work would finally be public. Daniel Reeves was never heard from again. On October 1st, colleagues tried to contact him and received no response. His phone went straight to voicemail. Emails bounced back as undeliverable. When friends went to his apartment on October 2nd, they found it completely empty. All his furniture was gone. All his documents were gone. The apartment was vacant, as if no one had ever lived there. His landlord said Daniel had sent an email on September 30th saying he was breaking his lease effective immediately and would forfeit his security deposit. The email came from Daniel's account, but none of his friends believed he'd sent it. The few journalists who had received his report found that their copies had been corrupted. The files would not open. The encrypted versions were intact, but Daniel had never sent out the decryption key. Or if he had, none of them received it. The posts containing the key on online forums had been deleted. Within a week, it was as if Daniel Reeves and his research had never existed. But there was one thing that survived. A researcher in California who had corresponded with Daniel had printed out a draft version of the Northwoods addendum pages before Daniel disappeared. He scanned the printout and posted it anonymously to a conspiracy theory website. Most people who saw it dismissed it as fake. It had no verification, no chain of custody, nothing to prove its authenticity. It looked like just another hoax document. But at the bottom of page 6 of the addendum, there was a sentence that some people read and could never quite forget. Control perception, and you control reality. We must ensure public consent even when they cannot see the truth. The conspiracy theory community debated for years about whether the Daniel Reeves story was real. No one could prove it either way. His social security number showed no activity after September 2015. His credit cards went dormant. His driver's license expired and was never renewed. His family, when contacted, said they had not heard from him and assumed he had left the country. But once in a while, someone on an obscure forum would post, "What if Northwoods never really ended? What if Daniel was right?" And then, in the late 2000 teens, people started noticing patterns. The way news stories about military interventions were covered. The way expert commentary seemed coordinated across multiple platforms. The way certain narratives appeared simultaneously in newspapers, on cable news, in think tank reports, in academic papers. It did not prove anything. It could all be coincidence or just the natural way that modern media ecosystems work. But some people remembered Daniel's research. They remembered the Gamma framework. They remembered that the government had once seriously proposed terrorizing its own citizens to manufacture consent for war. And they wondered, if they were willing to propose that then, what would they be willing to actually do now? Epilogue. In the fall of 2023, an anonymous package arrived at the offices of an investigative journalism nonprofit in Washington. The package contained a single sheet of paper, aged and yellowed, printed on the kind of onion skin carbon copy paper that government offices used in the 1960s. At the top of the page were 2 words, Contingency Gamma. Below that was a single paragraph. Gamma represents the final evolution of psychological warfare, turned inward upon the sponsoring population. The successful implementation of Gamma makes traditional false flag operations unnecessary. When perception is controlled at the narrative level, reality becomes irrelevant. The public will support any policy, accept any explanation, believe any official story provided the psychological framework has been properly established. This is not deception. This is the architecture of modern governance. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note, dated September 30, 2015. Northwoods never ended. It simply went underground. The note was unsigned, but handwriting analysis would later suggest it matched samples of Daniel Reeves' writing. The journalism organisation verified the paper was consistent with government documents from the 1960s. They could not verify anything else. They published the image online with a full disclaimer about its uncertain provenance. It went viral for approximately 48 hours. Then it was flagged as misinformation by major social media platforms, and its reach was limited. Within a week, most people had forgotten about it. But in a small apartment in College Park, Maryland, a graduate student working on her dissertation was reviewing records from the National Archives. She was looking through recently declassified files from the early 2000s. In a box of routine communications, she found a Department of Defense memo from 2016. The memo discussed information operations frameworks and mentioned historical continuity with Cold War-era perception management protocols. It contained one sentence that made her pause. Gamma principles remain foundational to modern strategic communications doctrine. She thought about requesting more information. She thought about digging deeper. Then she remembered the story of the researcher who had disappeared after investigating Operation Northwoods. She had always assumed it was an internet legend, the kind of creepy story conspiracy theorists tell each other. But now she was not so sure. She closed the file and moved on to the next box. Some things, she decided, were better left alone, and somewhere, in classified files that will not be declassified for another 50 years, a framework labelled Gamma continues to operate. The techniques are more sophisticated now, the technology is more advanced, the coordination is more seamless, but the basic principle remains unchanged. Control perception, and you control reality. Operation Northwoods was never really about Cuba. It was never really about false flag terrorism. It was about learning how to manufacture consent, how to shape reality itself, how to make people believe whatever you need them to believe. And they succeeded. Not in 1962, when the proposal was too crude, too obvious, too risky, but gradually, quietly, invisibly, until it became so normal, so ubiquitous, so woven into the fabric of modern life, that most people would never even think to question it. That is what Daniel Reeves discovered. That is what he tried to tell us, and that is why he disappeared. Because the truth about Operation Northwoods is not that it failed. The truth is that it succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination. It just took 60 years, and we are all living inside it now. The glow of 17 monitors bathed Elias Corrin's face in an ethereal blue light as his fingers danced across 3 keyboards simultaneously. In the depths of his converted basement apartment, time moved differently. Days blurred into nights, and nights stretched endlessly as he navigated the labyrinthine pathways of the dark web like a digital archaeologist, uncovering humanity's buried secrets. At 32, Elias had already earned and lost 2 fortunes through his hacking prowess. First fortune came easily. A teenage prodigy exploiting security vulnerabilities for corporate clients who paid millions to keep their weaknesses secret. He'd lived like a digital king, penthouses overlooking Silicon Valley, exotic cars that remained untouched in climate-controlled garages, while he preferred the glow of his monitors to sunlight. That first fortune vanished when he exposed Meridian Pharmaceuticals' cover-up of deadly side effects in their breakthrough arthritis medication. The leaked documents showed they'd known their drug caused cardiac episodes in 12% of patients over 60, but had buried the studies to protect their $10 billion investment. Elias had expected whistleblower protection. Instead, he found himself blacklisted from every major tech company, his reputation destroyed by a coordinated character assassination campaign that painted him as an unstable idealist who couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. The second fortune came from smaller clients, criminal organisations, corporate espionage rings, government contractors who needed deniability. The work paid well but corroded his soul, each job pulling him deeper into the shadows of the digital underworld. That money disappeared into legal fees after a wrongful arrest for hacking the Federal Reserve, a crime he hadn't committed but couldn't prove he hadn't, given his reputation and the circumstantial evidence that seemed perfectly crafted to implicate him. 2 years in minimum security prison had shown him the true cost of challenging powerful systems. The other inmates respected his technical skills, but the guards treated him like a dangerous terrorist. Solitary confinement stretched for months whenever he complained about conditions or tried to organise better treatment for his fellow prisoners. By the time he was released on a technicality, evidence had mysteriously gone missing. He'd learned that the system didn't just punish dissent, it transformed dissidents into cautionary tales. Now, money meant nothing to him, only truth mattered. His obsession with secret societies began innocently enough. A childhood fascination sparked by his grandfather's stories about World War II intelligence operations. The old man had worked as a codebreaker for the OSS, predecessor to the CIA, and had filled young Elias's imagination with tales of hidden messages and shadow wars. After his grandfather's death when Elias was 12, he'd found boxes of declassified documents in the attic, revealing just how much of recent history had been shaped by invisible hands. That childhood fascination evolved into a methodical hunt for evidence as he grew older and acquired the technical skills to dig deeper than amateur conspiracy theorists ever could. While other hackers chased Bitcoin fortunes and corporate espionage contracts, Elias pursued shadows and whispers, digital phantoms that most people dismissed as paranoid delusions. He'd spent years infiltrating closed forums where former intelligence operatives shared war stories, decrypting abandoned hard drives from defunct government contractors, and following digital breadcrumbs through the dark web's most obscure corners. His apartment had become a digital monastery dedicated to the pursuit of hidden truth, every surface covered with the tools and detritus of obsessive investigation. The apartment reflected his singular focus: pizza boxes stacked like ancient monuments between towers of computer equipment, energy drink cans forming metallic armies across every surface, and cables snaking through the darkness like digital veins feeding his electronic ecosystem. His only companions were the hum of cooling fans working overtime to prevent his overclocked processors from melting down, and the occasional, satisfied grunt when another firewall fell to his expertise. The basement location was perfect for his needs: thick concrete walls that muffled sound and blocked electromagnetic interference, a dedicated power line that could handle his massive electrical requirements, and most importantly, no windows for curious neighbours to peer through. He'd been living there for 18 months, ever since his release from prison, paying cash to a landlord who asked no questions as long as the rent arrived on time. His setup was a temple to digital paranoia: 17 monitors arranged in a semicircle around his custom-built chair, each screen dedicated to different aspects of his ongoing investigations. 3 keyboards allowed him to manage multiple intrusion attempts simultaneously, while a collection of smartphones, each running different operating systems and connected to various networks through proxy chains, kept him connected to his sources around the globe. The walls were lined with hard drives, each containing terabytes of encrypted data collected from years of systematic investigation. Backup systems ensured that even if authorities raided the apartment, copies of everything would remain safely hidden in data centers across 3 continents. He'd learned from his previous arrests that physical evidence was only as secure as your ability to keep it out of enemy hands. Tonight felt different. As rain drummed against the boarded windows, he'd covered them himself for security reasons, Elias's automated scanners detected something unusual. The software he'd written monitored thousands of government servers simultaneously, looking for anomalous data signatures that might indicate classified information stored in supposedly routine systems. Most alerts were false positives, but after years of refinement, his algorithms had learned to distinguish between genuine anomalies and random digital noise. This particular signal was trying too hard to look ordinary, which was exactly what made it suspicious. A government proxy server deep within the Department of Homeland Security's network infrastructure was handling traffic patterns that didn't match any known legitimate use. The data packets were the right size and frequency to appear routine, but they carried encryption signatures that suggested military-grade security protecting something far more sensitive than typical administrative communications. Most hackers would have dismissed it as a honeypot, a trap designed to lure in digital intruders, but Elias had learned to read between the digital lines over years of careful observation. This signal felt different, older, like it had been running for decades without anyone paying attention to what it was actually protecting. He leaned back in his chair, cracking his knuckles with the deliberate ritual of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. The proxy was 3 layers deep in government infrastructure, protected by military-grade encryption that would take months to crack through conventional means. But Elias had developed unconventional means over the years. His fingers resumed their dance, this time with the measured precision of a master pianist performing a familiar concerto. Code flowed across his screens like poetry written in ones and zeros, each line bringing him closer to whatever lay hidden in the digital vault. As the final encryption layer crumbled at 3:47 a.m, Elias held his breath. The archive that materialized before him contained terabytes of data, but it was the file structure that made his pulse quicken. Everything was organized with a kind of meticulous care reserved for the most sensitive operations. Categorical folders with cryptic names like cultural implementation, behavioral modification, and asset management. He opened the first file and the world as he understood it began to unravel. The contracts appeared first, hundreds of them, stretching back decades like a paper trail through the shadow history of American culture. Entertainment companies, advertising agencies, Record labels, movie studios, television networks, and news corporations all bound by identical non-disclosure agreements that ran to thousands of pages each. The legal language was deliberately obscure, buried in terminology that would confuse even experienced corporate lawyers who specialised in media contracts. But Elias had taught himself to decode legal doublespeak during his prison sentence, spending countless hours in the law library learning how power structures protected themselves through linguistic camouflage. Each contract referenced cultural programming initiatives and synchronized messaging protocols, with payment structures that dwarfed typical entertainment industry deals. Millions of dollars flowing to seemingly random projects, indie films that barely recouped production costs, music albums that never charted, advertising campaigns for products that didn't seem to exist. All payments were approved by a shell company called Apex Cultural Dynamics, whose corporate registration traced through a labyrinthine network of offshore entities. Elias followed the money trail through banks in Switzerland, shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, trust funds in Luxembourg, and holding companies in jurisdictions he'd never heard of. Every lead ultimately vanished into legal structures so complex they seemed designed more for obfuscation than profit. The internal memos were more revealing, written in the casual tone of executives who felt completely secure in their communications. Corporate leaders from supposedly competing companies discussed narrative adjustments and public sentiment cultivation, like weather forecasters predicting next week's conditions. One memo from a major news network's CEO, dated just 6 months ago, read, "Per our discussion with ACD representatives, the upcoming election cycle requires a 15% increase in anxiety-inducing content during primetime hours. Latest psychological impact studies suggest optimal effectiveness when paired with consumer advertising for comfort products and security solutions." Another memo from a streaming entertainment company outlined specific quotas. Q3 targets include 40% increase in dystopian future programming, 25% increase in surveillance state normalization themes, an introduction of transhumanist concepts through minimum of 12 original series. Demographic targeting should focus on the 18 to 34 age range for maximum long-term conditioning effectiveness. The coordination between supposedly independent media companies was breathtaking in scope. Competing networks shared detailed viewer psychological profiles, coordinated their news coverage to maximize specific emotional responses, and even synchronized their entertainment programming to reinforce particular worldviews. The memos discussed marketing research into subliminal messaging techniques, optimal timing for narrative reinforcement, and methods for making propaganda indistinguishable from organic cultural trends. Video stills scattered throughout the files showed meetings in nondescript conference rooms. Faces were often obscured, but the visible details painted a chilling picture. Executives from competing companies sitting side by side, reviewing presentations with titles like Mass Behavioral Prediction Models and Subliminal Integration Techniques. But it was the symbols that made Elias's blood run cold. They appeared everywhere, in corporate logos embedded in document headers, even watermarked into video files. The all-seeing eye perched atop pyramids, numerical sequences that corresponded to occult traditions, and geometric patterns that seemed random until viewed through the lens of esoteric knowledge. As dawn broke unnoticed outside his boarded windows, Elias began constructing his theory. The Illuminati weren't just folklore, they were real, organised, and operating in plain sight. Rather than ruling through force or political manipulation, they had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Cultural engineers who shaped reality through the careful manipulation of information and entertainment. The fragments suggested a coordinated effort spanning decades. Movies that promoted specific worldviews, music that carried subliminal messages, news coverage that guided public opinion toward predetermined conclusions. Every major cultural event seemed to serve a purpose beyond mere profit or entertainment. Elias created a new encrypted partition on his most secure drive and began organising the evidence. Each piece of the puzzle revealed new connections, new layers of coordination that defied conventional understanding of how media and culture operated. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying, but this was just the first door. As he prepared to dive deeper into the archive, a notification appeared on his screen. New files were uploading automatically to the server, added in real time from sources around the globe. The conspiracy wasn't just historical, it was happening now, every day, with machine-like precision. Elias smiled grimly and opened another energy drink. He had work to do. 3 days of continuous analysis revealed patterns so pervasive they defied coincidence. Elias's custom data mining algorithms had processed thousands of hours of Super Bowl halftime shows, major film releases, top-charting music, and primetime television programming, cross-referencing them with the archived documents he'd discovered. His software compared visual elements, audio frequencies, narrative structures, and symbolic content with mathematical precision that human observation alone could never achieve. The results were undeniable and terrifying. Every major halftime show since 2005 contained specific visual elements that served purposes beyond entertainment. Choreographed movements formed geometric patterns when viewed from aerial cameras, patterns that matched sacred geometry principles known to influence human consciousness. Lighting sequences pulsed at precisely calibrated frequencies, 10 Hz to induce alpha brain states associated with relaxation and suggestibility, 40 Hz bursts to trigger gamma waves linked to heightened emotional responses, and infrasound frequencies below human hearing that created subliminal anxiety responses. The costume designs weren't random fashion choices. They incorporated symbols from the archived files with mathematical precision. Ancient Egyptian imagery, Masonic symbols, occult numerology, but presented in ways that bypassed conscious recognition. The performers themselves were likely unaware of the deeper significance, but the production companies certainly understood every detail. Internal emails discussed symbolic integration quotas and archetypal reinforcement targets with the clinical precision of pharmaceutical dosing guidelines. Hollywood's role was even more sophisticated, operating as a vast conditioning apparatus disguised as entertainment. Elias discovered that blockbuster films weren't just profitable products. They were psychological programming exercises designed to shift public consciousness over decades. Action movies systematically normalized surveillance states, extrajudicial violence, and the acceptability of authoritarian responses to perceived threats. Romantic comedies promoted specific relationship models that prioritize consumption, instant gratification, and emotional instability over lasting partnership and family formation. Science fiction films served as perhaps the most insidious tool of all. They introduced technological and social concepts years before their real-world implementation, ensuring public acceptance when they finally emerged. Movies about neural implants preceded actual brain-computer interface development by exactly the time needed for audience conditioning. Films depicting cashless societies appeared precisely when digital currency infrastructure was being developed. Dystopian scenarios were presented as cautionary tales, while simultaneously making the depicted futures seem inevitable and acceptable. The music industry operated as the most direct delivery system for repetitive psychological messaging. Elias's analysis revealed that hit songs across all genres shared common structural elements designed to trigger specific neurological responses. Repetitive hooks created obsessive thought patterns, bass frequencies induced physical arousal responses, and lyrical themes consistently promoted materialism, emotional chaos, instant gratification, and distrust of traditional social bonds. Chart success wasn't organic. It was engineered through coordinated promotion campaigns that used psychological manipulation techniques refined through decades of marketing research. Record companies employed neuroscience consultants who designed songs to be literally addictive, triggering dopamine responses that created compulsive listening behaviors. The most successful artists weren't necessarily the most talented. They were the most effective delivery vehicles for predetermined psychological content. But the most chilling discovery came when Elias cross-referenced celebrity deaths with financial markets and policy implementations, using algorithms that could detect correlations across vast datasets that human analysis would miss. The patterns were subtle but statistically undeniable. Whenever a particularly influential public figure died under questionable circumstances, the news cycle would shift dramatically within hours. Public attention would focus intensely on mourning and memorial coverage, while significant legislation passed through Congress, with minimal scrutiny or public debate. Michael Jackson's death had coincided with the most controversial aspects of healthcare reform debates, providing a massive distraction precisely when public opposition was reaching critical mass. Whitney Houston's demise dominated headlines during crucial banking regulation discussions that would have reshaped Wall Street oversight. Prince's passing created a week-long media obsession that completely buried coverage of surveillance law expansions that civil liberties groups had been fighting for months. Each event generated exactly the right emotional state to facilitate predetermined political outcomes. The deaths created collective grief that made the public more passive and receptive to authority, while the intensive media coverage consumed the attention bandwidth that might otherwise have focused on policy changes. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was orchestrated with mathematical precision. Elias found evidence suggesting that some celebrity deaths might have been actively induced rather than simply exploited. Medical records showed unusual patterns of prescription drug interactions. Security camera footage from crucial moments was consistently corrupted or missing, and autopsy results often contained anomalies that suggested external intervention. The pattern was consistent across dozens of cases spanning 3 decades. But even more disturbing was the systematic cultivation of celebrity instability. Internal documents from talent agencies and record companies outlined deliberate strategies for creating psychological dependence, drug addiction, and emotional instability in their most valuable assets. The goal wasn't profit maximization, it was creating performers who could be easily manipulated and, when necessary, destroyed at moments that served larger political purposes. The conspiracy had weaponized celebrity worship itself, turning the public's emotional investment in famous figures into a tool for mass psychological manipulation. Every death became a ritual that renewed the collective trauma bonding between citizens and their media-created gods, making the population more dependent on external authority figures and less capable of independent critical thinking. Elias created a digital conspiracy board on his largest monitor, a sprawling network of connections that would have impressed investigative agencies worldwide if they hadn't been complicit in the system he was mapping. Red lines linked entertainment companies to intelligence agencies through shared personnel, financial investments, and operational coordination. Blue lines traced money flows through the labyrinthine network of shell corporations, revealing how massive sums moved between seemingly unrelated organizations. Green lines mapped the precise timing of cultural events to policy implementations, showing correlation patterns that achieved statistical significance far beyond chance. The board revealed the Illuminati's true genius. They had weaponized human attention itself, transforming consciousness into a battlefield where wars were fought through carefully orchestrated information campaigns. In an age of information overload, controlling what people focused on had become more valuable than controlling what they thought. Distraction had evolved into the ultimate form of mind control, more effective than physical force because victims participated willingly in their own manipulation. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying. Every major cultural trend of the past 30 years could be traced back to deliberate manipulation, orchestrated through the entertainment media complex. Fashion cycles that promoted specific body images and consumption behaviours. Social media trends that encouraged narcissistic self-documentation and reduced attention spans. Political movements that channeled genuine grievances into harmless symbolic protests that changed nothing. Even conspiracy theories themselves appeared to be guided phenomena, designed to discredit legitimate questioning by associating it with obviously false claims. As Elias studied his creation through bloodshot eyes that hadn't seen natural light in days, a pattern emerged that made him question everything he thought he knew about free will and human autonomy. The manipulation wasn't just cultural, it was neurological. The constant stream of engineered content was literally rewiring human brains on a species level, creating generations of people whose thoughts and desires had been shaped by external forces since birth. The evidence suggested that the traditional concept of individual choice had become largely illusory. In a world where every piece of information was filtered through manipulated channels, where every cultural touchstone carried hidden programming, where every social trend was artificially generated, what did it mean to make an independent decision? The conspiracy had achieved something more insidious than totalitarianism. They had created voluntary slavery disguised as freedom of choice. As Elias studied his creation, a pattern emerged that made him question everything he thought he knew about free will. Every major cultural trend of the past 30 years could be traced back to deliberate manipulation. Fashion cycles, social media behaviours, political movements, even conspiracy theories, all potentially guided by the same hidden hand. The realization struck him like a physical blow. If they could control culture so completely, how could he be certain his own obsession with finding them wasn't part of their plan? The media conglomerate's server proved surprisingly easy to penetrate, which should have been Elias's first warning. Titan Communications owned 17 major news networks, 43 radio stations, controlling interests in 12 social media platforms, and content distribution deals with virtually every major streaming service. Their annual revenue exceeded the GDP of most small nations, and their influence over global information flow was effectively unparalleled in human history. Their security should have been impenetrable. Military contractors protected their networks. They employed former NSA specialists as cybersecurity consultants, and their server farms were housed in facilities that rivaled government installations. Yet Elias's intrusion tools sliced through their defences like a hot knife through butter, encountering minimal resistance and no countermeasures. It was almost as if they wanted him inside their systems. The internal documents were even more damning than the government archive, revealing coordination that made wartime propaganda efforts look amateur by comparison. Daily emails outlined narrative priorities for each news cycle, complete with psychological impact assessments, demographic targeting strategies, and measurable public sentiment targets. The language was coldly clinical, reducing human emotion and belief to data points on quarterly performance spreadsheets. Editorial meetings were recorded and transcribed with military precision. News directors from supposedly competing networks participated in weekly coordination calls, where they discussed upcoming stories, agreed on messaging frameworks, and divided coverage responsibilities to ensure comprehensive narrative saturation. The goal wasn't profit, it was behavioural modification on a civilizational scale. One particularly chilling document was titled MK Ultra Evolution, Modern Behavioural Modification Through Repetitive Exposure. It outlined techniques that made the CIA's infamous mind control experiments look primitive and inefficient by comparison. Rather than targeting individuals through drugs and trauma, the new methods focused on mass psychological conditioning through carefully orchestrated media campaigns that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The manual explained in disturbing detail how repetitive exposure to specific imagery, sound frequencies, narrative structures, and emotional triggers could alter brain chemistry over extended periods. Citizens weren't being brainwashed in the traditional sense. They were being neurologically rewired through their daily media consumption, with changes that accumulated gradually over years and decades. The process was so subtle and pervasive that victims never realized their thoughts weren't entirely their own. Predictive programming emerged as a central technique in their arsenal. By introducing concepts, technologies, and social changes through fictional entertainment, before implementing them in reality, the manipulators could bypass critical thinking entirely. Audiences would unconsciously accept new surveillance technologies, social norms, and political systems because they had been psychologically prepared through years of entertainment conditioning that made the changes feel familiar and inevitable. The technique was devastatingly effective because it exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology. People naturally accepted ideas they had encountered multiple times, even if the initial exposure came through obviously fictional sources. The brain treated repeated fictional scenarios as potential realities, creating neural pathways that made actual implementation feel like a natural progression rather than a radical change. The financial section revealed the true scope of the operation. Trillions of dollars flowed through the network annually, dwarfing the budgets of most nations. The money came from unexpected sources: pension funds, insurance companies, even charitable foundations unknowingly contributed to the conspiracy through complex investment structures. But the most disturbing discovery was the coordination between intelligence agencies, banking institutions, entertainment corporations, and technology companies, operating as a unified organism despite their apparent competition and conflicting interests. Weekly video conferences brought together representatives from the CIA, Federal Reserve, major studios, social media platforms, and multinational technology corporations. They discussed sentiment management and narrative synchronization with the casual professionalism of corporate executives planning quarterly sales targets. The recordings revealed a shadow government that operated through corporate proxies rather than official political channels. Traditional governmental power had been largely superseded by a network of private organizations that could implement policy through market manipulation and cultural conditioning without the messy inconvenience of democratic oversight. Elections still occurred, but they had become elaborate theatre productions designed to maintain the illusion of popular sovereignty, while real decisions were made in boardrooms that the public never saw. News cycles weren't random or market-driven. They were orchestrated months in advance by committees that included intelligence operatives, banking executives, media moguls, and technology leaders. Wars provided distraction from economic manipulation, while generating massive profits for defense contractors. Celebrity scandals offered convenient cover for political corruption investigations. Natural disasters created opportunities to implement emergency powers that somehow always became permanent fixtures of the expanded surveillance state. Every major event served multiple purposes in a grand design that stretched across decades. The 2008 financial crisis had been engineered to consolidate banking power while conditioning the public to accept bailouts as normal economic policy. The COVID-19 pandemic had accelerated digital transformation initiatives while normalizing remote monitoring and social isolation. Climate change narratives were being used to justify energy sector reorganization and carbon credit markets that would generate enormous profits for the same financial institutions that had caused previous economic crises. Elias found recorded conversations between news anchors and their handlers that destroyed any remaining illusion about journalistic integrity. Popular television personalities who projected authority and trustworthiness were revealed as knowing participants in psychological manipulation campaigns, carefully crafting emotional triggers with the precision of weapons designers. They discussed techniques for inducing specific brain states in viewers, optimal timing for fear-based messaging, and methods for making propaganda indistinguishable from legitimate news reporting. The most chilling recordings involved discussions of population control strategies disguised as public health initiatives. Representatives from pharmaceutical companies, government health agencies, and media corporations coordinated messaging campaigns designed to promote dependency on medical interventions while discouraging natural immunity and traditional healing practices. The goal wasn't public health. It was creating a population that required constant pharmaceutical management to function normally. Mental health treatment had been weaponized through carefully designed chemical interventions that didn't cure underlying problems but created permanent pharmaceutical dependencies. Educational systems were being restructured to produce workers who could follow complex instructions but lacked the critical thinking skills to question authority. Even exercise and nutrition guidelines were manipulated to ensure that optimal physical and mental health remained just out of reach for the general population. The evidence was overwhelming, but as Elias prepared to copy the files to his secure drives, an error message appeared. Access denied. User privileges revoked. The server was locking him out in real time, which meant someone was actively monitoring his intrusion. He worked frantically to extract what data he could, but the digital walls were closing in. As the connection terminated, one final document appeared briefly on his screen. A personnel file with his photograph in the header Asset Management, Elias Corin. Status: Active Monitoring. The file vanished before he could read it completely, but the implications were clear. They knew he was coming. Desperation drove Elias deeper into the network than he had ever dared venture. Using techniques that bordered on digital necromancy, he resurrected connection pathways that should have been impossible to access. The risk was enormous. Each probe left digital fingerprints that could lead authorities directly to his door. But the glimpse of his own file had transformed his quest from curiosity to survival. The recordings he discovered in the deepest server vaults were audio files from meetings that shouldn't have existed, according to any official record. High-definition audio captured conversations between intelligence officials, Federal Reserve Board members, entertainment executives, technology billionaires, pharmaceutical industry leaders, and representatives from organizations he'd never heard of, but whose influence seemed to span continents. They discussed the future of human consciousness like generals planning military campaigns against an enemy population. The meetings followed a rigid schedule. Every third Wednesday of each month, participants would gather in a location identified only as the facility to review progress on what they called the Integration Project. The audio quality suggested advanced surveillance equipment, possibly indicating that someone within their organization was documenting everything for purposes that remained unclear. One recording from a meeting dated 6 months ago made his blood freeze in his veins. Phase 7, implementation has exceeded all projections, reported a woman's voice that analysis software identified as belonging to a major pharmaceutical company executive. Antidepressant dependency rates have reached 23% of the adult population in target demographics. Cognitive function degradation is proceeding on schedule, with marked decreases in long-term planning abilities and resistance to authority structures. Another voice, male with a distinctive southern accent. The cryptocurrency infrastructure is approaching full readiness for behavioral tracking integration. Once we achieve real-time monitoring of every financial transaction, thought control becomes mathematically precise. Every purchase will inform our psychological profiles. Every payment will be subject to conditional approval based on compliance metrics. Money itself becomes the ultimate surveillance and control mechanism. A third voice, older and carrying unmistakable authority. Excellent progress. The entertainment division reports successful integration of transhumanist themes across all major platforms. Public acceptance of neural interface technology has increased 23% since the campaign began, with particularly strong adoption rates among the 18 to 34 demographic. We're ready for beta testing in select metropolitan markets next quarter. The conversations continued for hours, revealing a surveillance state that made Orwell's 1984 look like a children's story. They weren't just watching citizens, they were psychologically profiling entire populations in real time, predicting dissent before it emerged, and neutralizing threats through targeted manipulation rather than direct confrontation. The system was so sophisticated that most people would never realize they were living under complete psychological control. The Integration Project appeared to be the culmination of decades of research into human behavior modification. Rather than controlling people through force or obvious propaganda, they had created a system that guided human decision-making through carefully crafted environmental pressures. Every choice citizens made was influenced by factors they never recognized as external manipulation, creating the illusion of free will while ensuring predetermined outcomes. Food additives that affected brain chemistry, architectural designs that induced specific emotional states, lighting frequencies that influence circadian rhythms, sound pollution calibrated to create chronic stress. Every aspect of modern life had been optimized to create psychological conditions that made populations easier to manage. The genius was that victims participated willingly in their own subjugation, often defending the very systems that enslaved them. The Watcher Protocol emerged as their most sophisticated tool. Rather than silencing conspiracy theorists and dissidents, they monitored them continuously, studying their methods and psychology. The data was used to identify others with similar thinking patterns, creating detailed maps of potential resistance before it could organize effectively. But the most chilling revelation was their approach to handling discovered threats. They didn't assassinate or imprison troublesome individuals, They drove them insane. Subtle psychological pressure, engineered coincidences, and carefully orchestrated personal tragedies would destroy a person's credibility and mental stability. Victims became their own worst enemies, discrediting themselves more effectively than any external force could. Elias found case studies documenting the destruction of dozens of individuals who had gotten too close to the truth, journalists who suffered sudden career implosions, researchers who developed inexplicable mental health problems, hackers who became paranoid and unstable. The pattern was consistent: initial discovery, followed by escalating pressure until the subject either retreated into obscurity or self-destructed publicly. As he absorbed this information, strange coincidences began occurring in his own life. His internet connection inexplicably slowed at crucial moments. Phone calls developed electronic interference. His food delivery orders were mysteriously cancelled or delayed. Each incident was minor and easily dismissed as random bad luck, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Someone was watching. Elias tried to dismiss his growing paranoia as a natural reaction to the disturbing information he was processing. But late at night, when the city was quiet and his monitors provided the only light, he sometimes heard footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment. They would pause at his door for exactly 30 seconds before continuing down the corridor. The recordings had mentioned something else, something that made his hands shake as he worked. Subject 347 shows exceptional pattern recognition abilities. Psychological profile suggests high probability of success in reaching final verification stage. Recommend maintaining current stimuli until extraction protocols can be implemented. He had no way of knowing for certain, but the timing suggested a horrible possibility. He might be Subject 347. The decision to leak his findings publicly felt like stepping off a cliff. Elias had accumulated enough evidence to expose a conspiracy that dwarfed anything in human history, but he knew that releasing it would likely cost him his life, or worse, his sanity. Yet the alternative was remaining silent while humanity sleepwalked toward a digital totalitarianism that would make physical oppression obsolete. He began by seeding information across the dark web's most secure forums, using identity masking techniques that should have made him untraceable. The posts were carefully crafted to appear as random discoveries by different users, avoiding the pattern recognition algorithms that monitored conspiracy communities. Each fragment of evidence was real but incomplete, requiring readers to connect the dots themselves. The response was immediate and disturbing. His posts gained traction quickly, too quickly. Within hours, they were being shared across platforms, analysed by citizen journalists, and discussed in mainstream media as examples of dangerous misinformation. The speed of the reaction suggested a coordinated response, as if the revelation had been anticipated and prepared for in advance. More troubling was the nature of the responses. While some users took the evidence seriously, others immediately began discrediting it with arguments that seemed too sophisticated to be spontaneous. They pointed to technical inconsistencies that Elias was certain didn't exist, questioned source authenticity with forensic expertise that suggested professional training, and redirected discussions toward harmless tangents that neutered the information's impact. Within days, his revelations were being treated as another internet conspiracy theory, filed alongside flat earth theories and lizard people claims. The evidence was dismissed not through logical refutation, but through association with obviously false ideas, a technique the archived documents had called cognitive contamination. As the online discussions evolved, Elias realized he was watching a masterpiece of psychological manipulation in real time. The truth was being buried not through censorship, but through calculated flooding with disinformation. His genuine evidence was drowning in a sea of deliberate nonsense, making it impossible for reasonable people to distinguish fact from fantasy. But the digital warfare was only the beginning. Physical reality began shifting around him in subtle but unmistakable ways. His internet speed slowed to a crawl whenever he tried to upload new evidence. Delivery services could no longer find his address. His phone developed a mysterious static that made conversations nearly impossible. Even his electricity began fluctuating at random intervals, causing his equipment to crash at the most inconvenient moments. The psychological pressure was more sophisticated than anything he had imagined from the case studies. Rather than obvious intimidation, he faced a constant series of minor inconveniences and technical failures that could be dismissed as coincidence by anyone who wasn't experiencing them directly. The effect was maddening, literally. He began questioning his own perceptions, wondering if paranoia was making him see patterns that didn't exist. Sleep became elusive as his apartment filled with unexplained sounds. Electronics hummed at frequencies that seemed designed to prevent rest. The heating system cycled erratically, creating temperature fluctuations that made comfort impossible. Water pressure dropped whenever he tried to shower, and his refrigerator developed a whine that stopped only when he was away from his computer. Friends and family members began expressing concern about his mental state, though he couldn't remember telling them about his research. They called with surprising frequency, all using similar language about the importance of seeking help and taking breaks from the computer. The conversations felt scripted, as if his loved ones were reading from prepared statements. As days blended into a haze of technical failures and social pressure, Elias realized he was living inside one of the case studies he'd discovered. They weren't just monitoring him, they were actively dismantling his life with surgical precision. But unlike the previous victims, he knew what was happening. That knowledge might be his only chance of survival. He had to reach the final layer of the archive before they completed their psychological destruction. If his theory was correct, the deepest files would contain the ultimate revelation, and possibly his salvation. The final server required every technique Elias had learned over 2 decades of hacking, protected by quantum encryption and guarded by AI systems that adapted to his intrusion attempts in real time. It represented the pinnacle of digital security. Yet as he worked through the night, fueled by desperation and the last of his energy drinks, the barriers fell with almost suspicious ease. The locked folder contained exactly what he had expected and feared: complete dossiers on hundreds of individuals, including himself. His file was massive, containing information that should have been impossible to collect. Screenshots of every computer session going back years, audio recordings from devices that shouldn't have had microphones, even biometric data tracking his health and emotional states in real time. But it was the analysis that truly horrified him. Psychological profiles predicted his behavior with uncanny accuracy, mapping his personality down to neurological quirks that he had never shared with anyone. The files detailed his childhood trauma, relationship patterns, cognitive biases, and emotional triggers with clinical precision. They knew him better than he knew himself. The surveillance had begun long before his current investigation. Webcam captures showed him staring at monitors in his apartment, taken from angles that suggested multiple hidden cameras. Phone conversations with friends and family had been recorded and analysed for stress patterns and emotional manipulation opportunities. Even his online shopping habits, medical records, and financial transactions had been fed into behavioural prediction algorithms. Most disturbing was the timeline. The earliest entries in his file dated back 15 years, to when he had first begun investigating conspiracy theories as a college student. They hadn't just discovered his activities, they had been watching and shaping them from the beginning. Every major breakthrough in his hacking skills, every connection he had made in underground communities, every piece of evidence he'd uncovered, all had been carefully orchestrated. The documents revealed the true scope of his manipulation. The pharmaceutical company he had exposed years earlier, the leaked documents had been strategically placed for him to find. The wrongful arrest that had cost him his fortune, engineered to isolate him and fuel his paranoia. Even his current apartment had been selected for him, the basement location perfect for the psychological pressure techniques they planned to employ, but the most shattering revelation was still to come. As he scrolled through terabytes of personal data, a video file caught his attention. The timestamp showed it was recorded 3 days ago, the night he had first accessed the government server. The video showed him working at his computer, but the angle was impossible. The camera had to be inside his monitor, watching him as he discovered the conspiracy. He was staring at footage of himself reading about his own surveillance. The video continued, showing him creating his digital conspiracy board, making connections between entertainment companies and intelligence agencies, even the moment when he had first seen his own photograph in the corporate files. But there was something else, a timestamp in the corner that made no sense. According to the file properties, the video had been created 6 months before it was allegedly recorded. His hand shaking, Elias cross-referenced the timestamp with other files in his dossier. The pattern that emerged destroyed everything he thought he knew about his investigation. Every revelation, every breakthrough, every piece of evidence he had discovered, all had been prepared in advance. The conspiracy he had uncovered was real, but his discovery of it had been choreographed down to the minute. They hadn't just been watching him, they had been directing him, feeding him information at precisely calculated intervals, allowing him to feel the satisfaction of discovery while ensuring he found only what they wanted him to find. His entire investigation was a performance, and he had been playing his role perfectly. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment was no longer mysterious. It was his cue that the final act was about to begin. The timestamp that shattered Elias's world appeared in a routine system log, buried among thousands of other entries he might have overlooked in his haste to process the overwhelming data. But his pattern recognition skills, honed by decades of digital archaeology, caught the anomaly immediately. His surveillance file had been created 3 years before he had even begun his serious investigation into secret societies. Not updated, not modified, created. The implications spread through his mind like digital wildfire. Every forum post that had sparked his interest, every breadcrumb of evidence he had followed, every contact who had guided him toward new information sources, all had been carefully planted elements in an elaborate psychological experiment. He wasn't hunting the Illuminati. He was their laboratory rat, navigating a maze they had constructed specifically for him. The files reveal the true scope of the operation. Project Cassandra aimed to study how individuals with specific psychological profiles could be guided toward predetermined conclusions while believing they were conducting independent research. Elias was test subject 347 in a series that had already processed thousands of potential dissidents, conspiracy theorists, and amateur investigators. The methodology was diabolical in its sophistication. Rather than suppressing information, they had created controlled leaks that satisfied the subject's desire for hidden truth, while ensuring that any revelations served their ultimate purposes. Every conspiracy theorist who believed they had uncovered secret plots was actually participating in a massive behavioural study that helped refine mass manipulation techniques. But Project Cassandra served another purpose, creating the perfect patsies. When subjects like Elias inevitably attempted to share their discoveries, the public would dismiss them as delusional paranoids. The conspiracy theorists discredited themselves more effectively than any government censorship could, providing cover for the real operations happening in plain sight. The genius was circular. They used genuine conspiracies to hide their conspiracy to create conspiracy theories. The Ouroboros of manipulation consumed its own tail while strengthening the head. Elias found video recordings of planning meetings where researchers discussed his psychological profile like entomologists studying an insect. His obsessive personality, his need for validation through intellectual superiority, his isolation and distrust of mainstream society, all were noted as advantageous traits for the experiment. They had identified him as an ideal subject before he had even begun his journey into the digital underground. The recordings were clinical in their detachment. Subject 347 shows exceptional persistence and pattern recognition abilities. Recommend accelerating the revelation timeline to achieve maximum psychological impact. His technical skills allow for more sophisticated evidence plants than previous subjects. Agreed. The deep web forums are seeded and ready. Will allow him to discover the entertainment industry connections next week, followed by the financial networks the following month. Estimated timeline to complete breakdown, 6 to 8 months. What about extraction? Standard protocol. Once he achieves full paranoid state, we'll activate the final revelation. The cognitive dissonance should ensure complete psychological collapse within 72 hours. Subject will either retreat into catatonic withdrawal or self-eliminate. Either outcome serves project goals. The footsteps outside his door had stopped. In the silence that followed, Elias could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like a countdown timer. Every shadow in his peripheral vision might be a hidden observer. Every electronic device could be a surveillance tool. Even his own thoughts felt compromised, infected by the knowledge that his mind had been invaded and mapped by researchers who understood his psychology better than he did. But as despair threatened to overwhelm him completely, a final realization emerged from the chaos of his collapsing worldview. If they had created all of this as an experiment, if his investigation was a carefully orchestrated performance, then the evidence he had found might be real after all. They couldn't manipulate him with fake conspiracies. They had to use genuine ones to make the manipulation believable. The entertainment industry coordination, the financial manipulation, the psychological conditioning of entire populations, it was all real. His discovery of it might have been staged, but the conspiracy itself existed exactly as he had uncovered it. They had made one critical error in their psychological experiment. They had given him access to the truth. The question was whether that knowledge could serve any purpose now that he understood his role as an unwitting puppet. As the footsteps resumed outside his door, moving with deliberate slowness toward his apartment, Elias realized he had perhaps minutes to decide how this story would end. He could retreat into madness as they expected, becoming another cautionary tale about the dangers of conspiracy thinking. He could attempt to fight back, though they had mapped every aspect of his psychology and would anticipate any strategy he might devise. Or he could find a third option, something they hadn't planned for because it lay outside their understanding of his character. The gentle knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. A voice, polite and professional, spoke through the thin wood. "Mr. Corrin, we need to talk." Elias looked at his screens one final time, at the conspiracy board that had consumed his life, at the evidence that proved humanity was being manipulated on a scale beyond historical precedent. Then he looked at his reflection in the dark monitor, the face of a man who had discovered that his greatest fear and greatest hope were the same thing. He had found the truth. The truth had been carefully crafted to find him. But perhaps, in that circular dance of manipulation and discovery, lay an opportunity that neither he nor his watchers had anticipated. After all, even the most sophisticated psychological experiment could produce unexpected results. As he reached for the door handle, Elias Corrin smiled for the first time in months. If they had taught him anything, it was that reality was far more malleable than most people believed. And if reality could be shaped, then perhaps it was time for the subject to become the experimenter. The door opened to reveal figures in dark suits, their faces professional masks hiding whatever emotions they might have felt. But as they looked into Elias's eyes, something shifted in their expressions, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested their psychological profiles might have missed something crucial about their carefully studied subject. "Gentlemen," Elias said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind, "I've been expecting you. Shall we discuss what happens next?" The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. What if everything you thought you knew about the pyramids was wrong? Imagine standing inside the Great Pyramid of Giza at midnight, alone, surrounded by 2.3 million stone blocks that have kept their secrets for over 4 millennia. The air is thick with mystery, and you can feel something humming beneath your feet. A vibration so subtle it might just be your imagination. Or might it be something far more extraordinary? Tonight join Dr. Marcus Chen, a field researcher whose life's work straddles the boundary between archaeology and physics, as he uncovers evidence that will shake the very foundations of what we believe about ancient Egypt. This isn't just another story about pharaohs and burial chambers. This is about technology so advanced, so perfectly engineered, that modern science is only beginning to understand its true purpose. Are you ready to discover that the Great Pyramid wasn't built to house the dead, but to power the living? The desert wind carried more than sand that October evening. It carried the weight of 4,000 years of secrets, swirling around the massive limestone blocks that rose from the Giza plateau like ancient guardians against the darkening sky. Dr. Marcus Chen pulled his field jacket tighter as he approached the entrance to the Great Pyramid, his archaeological permit clutched in one hand and a case of sensitive instruments in the other. For 15 years, Marcus had studied these monuments from afar, poring over blueprints in university libraries, analysing satellite imagery, and debating theories with colleagues over late-night coffee. He'd written papers on the pyramid's mathematical precision, its astronomical alignments, and its construction techniques. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment. The entrance shaft yawned before him like the mouth of some primordial beast. His Egyptian guide, Hassan, gestured him forward with a weathered hand that had led countless tourists through these passages. But tonight was different. Tonight Marcus had special permission to remain inside after closing, to conduct his research in the profound silence that only comes when the tourist crowds fade away. "Doctor?" "Chen," Hassan said, his English tinged with the accent of the Nile Delta. "You're sure you want to stay alone? The pyramid. She speaks differently at night." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what Hassan meant. "I need to take measurements without interference. The electromagnetic readings are too important to risk contamination from cameras and cell phones." As they ducked through the entrance and began their descent into the ancient passageway, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected, a subtle vibration through the soles of his boots. It was barely perceptible, like standing near a power plant or a subway station, but unmistakably present. The limestone blocks seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, as if the entire structure were somehow alive. "Hassan," he said, pausing to place his palm against the cool stone wall, "do you feel that?" The guide's eyes met his in the dim LED lighting they'd strung along the passage. "You feel it too?" Most visitors, they notice nothing, but some, the ones who know how to listen, they feel the heart of the pyramid beating. Marcus's scientific mind immediately began cataloguing possible explanations: seismic activity from Cairo traffic, thermal expansion and contraction of the limestone, perhaps underground water movement. But as they climbed deeper into the structure, following the grand gallery toward the king's chamber, the sensation only grew stronger. The textbooks had described every measurement, every angle, every architectural feature, but they had failed to capture this, the sense that he was walking through the corridors of a machine rather than a tomb. The walls weren't just precisely cut, they were purposeful, functional, as if each block had been positioned not just to support weight, but to channel something else entirely. By the time Hassan left him alone in the king's chamber with his instruments, and a promise to return at dawn, Marcus was beginning to suspect that everything he thought he knew about the Great Pyramid was about to change. The silence in the king's chamber was absolute. Not the gentle quiet of a library or the muffled stillness of a snow-covered landscape, but the profound absence of sound that only exists deep within solid rock far from the surface world. Marcus set his equipment case on the granite floor and began unpacking his instruments, but his eyes kept returning to the walls around him. For a structure supposedly built as the eternal resting place of Pharaoh Khufu, the king's chamber was remarkably empty. No hieroglyphs adorned the walls, no colourful depictions of the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. No ornate decorations celebrating his divine status, just smooth, precisely fitted granite blocks that formed a perfect rectangular space. Marcus had visited dozens of legitimate Egyptian tombs, from the elaborate burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings to smaller mastabas scattered throughout the desert. Every single one had been filled with artwork, inscriptions and symbolic elements designed to guide and protect the deceased in the afterlife. The Egyptians were obsessive about decorating their tombs. It was perhaps their most distinctive cultural trait. So why was the most important tomb in Egypt completely bare? He pulled out his digital calipers and began measuring the chamber's dimensions, cross-referencing them with his notes. 10.47 metres long, 5.24 metres wide, 5.84 metres high. But as he worked, something else caught his attention: the acoustics. "Hello?" he called out softly, and the word came back to him transformed. Not a simple echo, but something more complex, a resonance that seemed to build upon itself, creating harmonics that his voice alone couldn't produce. He clapped his hands sharply and the sound reverberated through the chamber in waves, each echo slightly different from the last. Marcus had studied acoustical engineering as part of his physics background, and he knew what he was hearing. The chamber was tuned. The proportions, the materials, even the placement in the pyramid weren't arbitrary. They had been calculated to create specific resonant frequencies. He set up his sound meter and began a systematic test, clapping at different spots around the chamber and recording the acoustic response. The data was remarkable. The chamber was resonating at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that research had shown could induce altered states of consciousness in humans. Ancient peoples around the world had built structures with similar acoustic properties. Newgrange in Ireland, the Hippogæum in Malta, certain chambers at Stonehenge. But there was something more. As Marcus moved his sound meter around the room, he noticed that the acoustic properties weren't uniform. The northeast corner produced different harmonics than the southwest. The centre of the chamber created the strongest resonance, while areas near the walls seemed to dampen certain frequencies while amplifying others. It was as if the entire chamber had been designed as a three-dimensional instrument, capable of producing complex acoustic patterns that modern sound engineers would struggle to replicate. This wasn't the work of ancient stonemasons building a burial vault. This was the product of sophisticated understanding of wave mechanics and acoustic engineering. Marcus sat cross-legged in the centre of the chamber and closed his eyes, letting the subtle vibrations he'd felt earlier wash over him. The sensation was stronger here, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. It reminded him of standing next to a massive pipe organ, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest cavity. But there were no pipes here, no mechanical system that could produce such vibrations, unless... He opened his eyes and looked up at the ceiling, with its 9 massive granite beams supporting thousands of tons of limestone above. Each beam weighed between 25 and 80 tons, and had been quarried from Aswan 500 miles to the south. The precision with which they'd been placed was extraordinary. The gaps between them were uniform to within millimetres. What if those gaps weren't just structural? What if they were intentional spacing, designed to create specific resonant frequencies when subjected to external forces? The entire chamber could be functioning as a resonating cavity, with the granite beams acting as tuning elements. Marcus pulled out his electromagnetic field detector and switched it on. Immediately the device began registering low-level EM activity. Not strong, but definitely present and distinctly non-random. The readings were strongest near the walls and seemed to pulse in rhythm with the vibrations he could feel through the floor. No pharaoh had ever been found in this chamber. No evidence of burial had ever been discovered. No grave goods, no mummy. No indication that this space had ever served its supposed purpose as a tomb. But it was definitely serving some purpose. The question was, what? The next morning, Hassan returned to find Marcus still awake, surrounded by printouts from his instruments and covered in limestone dust. The researcher had spent the night exploring every accessible passage in the pyramid, and his findings were beginning to form a picture that contradicted everything in the archaeological textbooks. "Dr. Chen, you look like you've seen the jinn," Hassan said, offering him a thermos of strong coffee. "What did the pyramid tell you?" Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully and gestured toward his scattered notes. "Hassan, I need to see the subterranean chamber, the one most tourists never visit." Hassan's expression grew serious. "That chamber, she is dangerous. Very old, very deep. The air is not good there." "I have proper equipment," Marcus insisted, "and I think what's down there might be the key to understanding what this place really is." An hour later, they were descending through a narrow shaft that led to the lowest accessible level of the pyramid. The subterranean chamber lay more than 30 metres beneath the base of the structure, carved directly from the bedrock. As they went deeper, the temperature dropped and the air grew thick with moisture. The passage opened into a rough-hewn chamber unlike anything else in the pyramid. Where the king's chamber was precisely cut granite, this space looked unfinished, almost crude. But Marcus wasn't interested in the chamber itself, he was focused on the walls. "Hassan, bring the light closer." The LED beam revealed what Marcus had hoped to find: unmistakable signs of water erosion. The limestone walls bore the smooth, flowing patterns that only come from sustained contact with moving water. Not the random pitting of desert sandstorms or the crystalline deposits of occasional flooding, but the systematic erosion of deliberate water flow. Marcus ran his fingers along the channels carved into the rock. This wasn't occasional flooding. Water flowed through here regularly, probably for centuries. Hassan nodded. "My grandfather, he told stories. Before the dam, before the modern irrigation, the Nile would flood every year. Sometimes the water would find ways underground, through cracks and caves. Maybe it came here." But Marcus was thinking about more than just flood patterns. He pulled out a geological map of the area and spread it on his portable table. The Giza Plateau sat on a limestone shelf that extended deep underground, honeycombed with natural caves and passages. The Nile, just a few kilometres away, had carved its path through this same limestone over millions of years. "Hassan, what if the annual flooding wasn't accidental? What if this chamber was designed to flood?" He pointed to the roughly carved passages that branched off from the main chamber, disappearing into darkness. These could be intake channels. When the Nile floods, water would flow through underground passages and fill this chamber, then rise up through the pyramid's internal structure. Marcus began sketching a diagram, his excitement growing. "Look at this. Water enters here, rises through the Grand Gallery, which is angled like a spillway, and reaches the king's chamber. But that chamber isn't at the top of the pyramid. There are shafts leading up from it." Hassan studied the drawing. "You think the pyramid was some kind of water machine? Not just water. Think about what happens when you force pressurized water through granite." Hassan looked puzzled, so Marcus elaborated. "Granite contains quartz crystals. When you subject quartz to mechanical pressure, like water flowing under pressure, it generates electricity. It's called the piezoelectric effect. We use it in modern electronics." The implications were staggering. If Marcus was right, the Great Pyramid wasn't a tomb at all. It was a hydroelectric generator, using the annual Nile floods to create pressurized water flow through chambers lined with granite. The precise positioning of the granite blocks, the careful engineering of the internal passages, the acoustic tuning of the chambers, all of it could be explained as components of a massive power generation system. Marcus spent the next several hours taking measurements of the subterranean chamber, documenting the erosion patterns and mapping the passages. Every piece of evidence supported his growing hypothesis. The pyramid builders hadn't just been skilled stonemasons, they had been hydraulic engineers, working with an understanding of electricity that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 18th century. But that raised an even more disturbing question. If the ancient Egyptians possessed this level of technological sophistication, what else had they known that modern archaeology had missed? And why had this knowledge been lost? As they climbed back toward the surface, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking through the ruins of a civilization far more advanced than anyone had imagined. The desert wind that greeted them at the pyramid's entrance seemed to carry whispers of forgotten science, lost wisdom, and secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The next day found Marcus standing on the Giza Plateau at dawn, his GPS equipment spread out on a folding table, as the first rays of sunlight painted the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. Hassan had brought along his cousin Karim, a modern engineer who worked for the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and had access to more sophisticated surveying equipment than Marcus could carry. "Dr. Chen, you said you wanted to verify the pyramid's alignment," Karim asked, adjusting the precision GPS receiver. "I must tell you, this has been measured many times. The accuracy is well documented." Marcus nodded, checking his own instruments. "I'm not questioning the accuracy. I'm trying to understand why that accuracy was necessary." The numbers were indeed remarkable. As the GPS data streamed in and the surveying laser painted its invisible lines across the desert, the measurements confirmed what archaeologists had known for decades. The Great Pyramid was aligned to true north, with an accuracy of just 3 arc minutes, less than 1/20th of a degree. In modern terms, that was more precise than the magnetic compasses available to 19th century explorers. But Marcus was looking at more than just cardinal directions. He had brought along a magnetometer, an instrument that could detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field. As he moved the device around the pyramid's base, the readings told a fascinating story. "Karim, look at this." Marcus showed him the magnetometer display. "The pyramid isn't just aligned to true north. It's positioned at a point where the Earth's magnetic field shows unusual characteristics. The Giza Plateau sat at a convergence point of several magnetic anomalies. Underground iron ore deposits created localized field variations, while the limestone bedrock contained enough ferrous minerals to influence compass readings. But more significantly, the pyramid's position corresponded to a point where the Earth's natural electromagnetic currents were particularly strong. Marcus had studied similar phenomena at other ancient sites. Stonehenge sat on a complex intersection of underground streams and geological fault lines that created measurable electromagnetic effects. Newgrange in Ireland was positioned where 2 underground rivers converged, creating conditions that produced natural electrical fields. Machu Picchu was built on a granite peak that generated piezoelectric charges during seismic activity. The pattern was consistent. Ancient builders had chosen locations where the Earth's natural electromagnetic properties were enhanced. They hadn't just been looking for stable ground or religious significance. They had been searching for specific energetic conditions. "Hassan," Marcus called to his guide, who was photographing the sunrise from the pyramid's eastern face, "your grandfather's stories. Did any of them mention lights?" Hassan walked over, his expression thoughtful. "Lights? You mean like the tourist illumination?" "No, I mean lights that might have been seen historically, strange lights, unexplained phenomena." Hassan's eyes widened slightly. "Ah, yes. The old people, they would speak of the lights that danced around the pyramid during certain seasons, usually during the flood time, when the Nile was high. They called them the souls of the pharaohs, but my grandfather, he was educated man. He thought maybe they were something else." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What kind of something else? He worked for British archaeologists in the 1920s. They had instruments, cameras. One night during flood season, they saw lights moving around the pyramid's apex. Blue-white lights, like electricity. The photographs they took showed, what do you call them? Discharge patterns. Electromagnetic discharge. Marcus had seen similar phenomena at other ancient sites during periods of high atmospheric electricity. If the pyramid was designed to interact with the Earth's electromagnetic field, then during certain conditions, perhaps when underground water levels were high and atmospheric electrical activity was increased, it might actually generate visible electrical discharges. Marcus spent the morning taking detailed measurements of the electromagnetic conditions around the pyramid. The data revealed a complex pattern of electrical activity that varied with the time of day, the season, and the underground water levels. The pyramid wasn't just passively sitting in an electromagnetically active location. It appeared to be designed to harness and focus that activity. The internal structure suddenly made more sense. The king's chamber, with its precise granite construction, would act as a focal point for electromagnetic energy generated by the pressure of water on quartz crystals. The shaft systems leading from the chamber would serve as waveguides, directing the electrical energy toward the pyramid's apex. The entire structure was essentially a massive electromagnetic antenna, designed to capture, generate and transmit electrical energy using natural forces. But transmit it where? And for what purpose? As Marcus packed his equipment, he realized he was no longer looking at an ancient tomb or even an advanced power plant. He was looking at a piece of technology so sophisticated that modern science was only beginning to understand its principles. The builders of the Great Pyramid hadn't just mastered hydraulic engineering and electromagnetic theory. They had created a machine that interfaced directly with the planet's own energy systems. The question that haunted him as they walked back to the nearby village was this: if such advanced technology had existed over 4,000 years ago, what had happened to the civilization that created it? Dr. Amara Soliman met Marcus at a coffee shop in central Cairo, away from the tourist crowds and government oversight that surrounded the Giza Plateau. As one of Egypt's leading thermal imaging specialists, she'd been involved in some of the most significant recent discoveries at the pyramids, including the 2015 detection of mysterious voids within the Great Pyramid structure. "Dr. Chen," she said, sliding a tablet across the small table between them, "what you're asking to see, these images are not for public distribution. The Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities has been very careful about how this information is released." Marcus studied the thermal imaging data on the screen. The pyramid appeared as a three-dimensional wireframe, with different colours indicating temperature variations within the stone. But there, clearly visible in the computer-enhanced images, were several dark voids, empty spaces within the solid limestone structure where no chambers were supposed to exist. "How many voids have you detected?" Marcus asked. "At least 4 significant ones," Dr. Soliman replied, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. 2 above the king's chamber, 1 behind the queen's chamber, and 1 near the base that appears to connect to the subterranean areas. But there's something else. She switched to a different set of images, these taken with ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic sensors. These voids aren't natural. They show clear geometric patterns, right angles, precisely measured dimensions. Someone built these spaces intentionally, then sealed them so completely that they've remained hidden for over 4,000 years. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Have there been any attempts to access them? Dr. Solomon's expression grew troubled. That's where things become political. In 2017, an international team proposed using micro-robotics to explore one of the smaller voids. They had the technology, the funding, and preliminary approval from the Archaeological Committee. Then suddenly the project was cancelled. No explanation, no appeal process, just stopped. She leaned closer, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. "Dr. Chen, I've worked on heritage preservation projects throughout Egypt for 15 years. I've seen government bureaucracy, funding problems, international disputes over archaeological sites. This was different. This was suppression." Marcus thought about his own experience getting research permission. The process had taken 8 months and required letters of recommendation from 3 different universities, a detailed research proposal, and a substantial fee. But even with all that paperwork, his access was limited to already known chambers during specific time windows. "What do you think is in the sealed chambers?" he asked. Dr. Solomon switched to another set of images, these showing electromagnetic anomalies within the hidden voids. These readings suggest metallic objects, not just small artifacts, large structures with geometric patterns. If I had to guess based on the electromagnetic signatures, I'd say we're looking at copper or bronze constructions, possibly in the form of coils or geometric frameworks. Marcus's mind raced. Copper coils would be consistent with his power plant hypothesis. They could serve as electromagnetic conductors or even primitive electrical components. Bronze geometric frameworks might function as focusing elements for electromagnetic energy. "There's something else, Doctor," Solomon continued, bringing up a final image. "This thermal scan was taken during different seasons over a 3-year period. Look at how the temperature signatures in the voids change. The hidden chambers appeared to respond to external conditions, cooling during dry seasons and warming during periods of high humidity. More intriguingly, the temperature variations showed patterns that corresponded to the Nile's traditional flood cycle, even though the river had been controlled by dams for decades. It's as if these chambers are still responding to environmental changes," Dr. Solomon said, "as if whatever system they're part of is still partially functional." Marcus studied the data for several minutes, his theory crystallizing into something approaching certainty. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient power plant, It was a machine with components that were still sealed inside, still responding to the same environmental triggers that had activated it thousands of years ago. Dr. Solomon, hypothetically, if someone wanted to access these chambers using modern technology, how would they do it? She looked around the coffee shop nervously. Hypothetically, millimeter wave radar could map the internal structure precisely. Microbore drilling could create access holes small enough to insert fibre optic cameras. With the right equipment, you could explore these spaces without causing significant structural damage to the pyramid. Marcus nodded, already calculating what such an expedition would cost and how it might be organised. But Dr. Solomon wasn't finished. Dr. Chen, there's something you should know. I'm not the first person to detect these chambers, and I won't be the last. But every researcher who has tried to investigate them seriously has found their access restricted, their funding cut, or their careers redirected. The Egyptian government isn't trying to preserve the pyramid from damage. They're trying to preserve its secrets from discovery. As Marcus walked back through Cairo's bustling streets, he realised he was no longer conducting academic research. He was investigating a cover-up that had been maintained for decades, possibly longer. The question was no longer what the pyramid had been designed to do. It was why someone was so determined to prevent modern science from finding out. That night, Marcus returned to the pyramid alone. Hassan had arranged for him to have extended access, though the guide had seemed reluctant to leave him there as darkness settled over the Giza plateau. Dr. Chen, the pyramid. She's different at night. You be careful, yes? Some knowledge, it comes with price. Now, sitting in absolute darkness in the king's chamber with his instruments powered down and his cell phone turned off, Marcus could feel what Hassan had meant. The vibrations he'd noticed on his first day weren't stronger at night. They were clearer, unmasked by the electromagnetic interference of modern technology and the subtle vibrations of daytime activity. The feeling was unmistakable now, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones around him. It reminded him of sitting in a car with a powerful subwoofer, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest. Except this sensation seemed to penetrate deeper, affecting not just his body but his consciousness itself. Marcus had brought along a new piece of equipment, a sensitive electromagnetic field detector borrowed from Dr. Solomon's laboratory. In the complete darkness and electrical silence of the chamber, the device could register even the faintest electromagnetic activity. He switched it on and watched the display with growing amazement. The pyramid was generating electricity. Not much. The readings were measured in millivolts and microamps, but the output was consistent, rhythmic, and definitely real. The electromagnetic field strength varied in cycles that corresponded to the acoustic resonance he'd measured earlier. The entire structure was functioning as a low-level electrical generator, powered by forces he was only beginning to understand. Marcus activated his night vision camera and began recording, speaking in whispers to avoid disturbing whatever delicate processes he was observing. The electromagnetic readings are strongest near the northeast corner of the chamber, consistent with the acoustic anomalies I documented earlier. The field strength appears to correlate with lunar cycles. Tonight's readings are approximately 20% higher than last week's, coinciding with the new moon. He moved the detector around the chamber, mapping the electromagnetic field as he had mapped the acoustics. The patterns were complex but consistent, forming a three-dimensional matrix of electrical activity that encompassed the entire chamber. At the centre of the room, where the pharaoh's sarcophagus should have been, the electromagnetic field reached its peak intensity. But there was something else. As Marcus sat in the centre of the chamber, surrounded by the electrical field generated by 4,000 years of precisely engineered stone, he began to experience something unexpected, altered consciousness. It started as a subtle shift in perception, similar to the disorientation he'd felt at high altitude or during meditation. But as he remained motionless in the electromagnetic field, the sensation deepened. His thoughts became clearer, more focused, while his awareness of the chamber around him expanded. He could sense the massive weight of the pyramid above him, the underground chambers below, even the subtle movements of air through the shaft systems. Marcus realised that the 110 Hz acoustic resonance he'd measured wasn't accidental. It was the exact frequency that research had shown could induce theta brainwave states associated with deep meditation, enhanced creativity, and altered consciousness. Combined with the electromagnetic field, the King's Chamber functioned as a consciousness-altering device. But why? What purpose would ancient builders have had for creating a machine that could systematically alter human consciousness? As Marcus sat in the pyramid's electromagnetic embrace, understanding dawned on him like sunrise over the desert. The pyramid wasn't just a power plant, it was a communication device. The electrical energy it generated wasn't meant to power lights or machinery, it was designed to amplify and transmit human consciousness itself. The ancient Egyptians had built the ultimate meditation chamber, a place where human awareness could be enhanced, expanded, and potentially transmitted across vast distances. The precision engineering, the electromagnetic properties, the acoustic tuning, all of it served to create conditions where consciousness could transcend the normal limitations of the human brain. Marcus thought about the ancient Egyptian concepts of Ka and Ba, aspects of the human soul that could travel beyond the physical body. What if these weren't just religious beliefs, but actual descriptions of consciousness, projection experiences facilitated by the pyramid's technology? The implications were staggering. If ancient Egyptians had mastered consciousness projection, they could have explored distant lands without physical travel, communicated across vast distances without messengers, and perhaps even preserved knowledge in ways that transcended physical destruction. The pyramid might have been their internet, their telecommunications network, their method of backing up human consciousness itself. Marcus's instruments continued recording as his awareness expanded further. He could sense other presences in the chamber, not supernatural entities, but echoes of the thousands of people who had experienced altered states in this space over the millennia. The pyramid had been accumulating consciousness, storing it in some form that science didn't yet understand. As the hours passed, Marcus began to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd discovered. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient monument, it was a machine for expanding human potential, built by a civilization that understood the relationship between consciousness, electromagnetic energy, and the fundamental structure of reality itself. But why had this knowledge been lost, and why were modern authorities so determined to prevent its rediscovery? As dawn approached and the electromagnetic readings began to fluctuate with the rising sun, Marcus made a decision that would change the course of his research, and possibly his life. He wasn't going to publish his findings in academic journals where they could be dismissed or suppressed. He was going to find a way to demonstrate the pyramid's true capabilities to the world. The Age of Secrets was about to end. 3 weeks after his night in the King's Chamber, Marcus found himself in a secure conference room at Cairo University, surrounded by researchers who had responded to his carefully worded communications. Dr. Solomon sat across from him, along with Dr. James Morrison, a British archaeoacoustic specialist, Dr. Elena Kozlov, a Russian electromagnetic researcher, and surprisingly, Dr. Sarah Running Bear, a Lakota physicist who studied indigenous sacred sites in North America. "What you're suggesting, Doctor?" "Chen," Dr. Morrison said, reviewing Marcus's data on his tablet, "goes beyond revolutionary. You're proposing that ancient civilizations possess technology that we're only beginning to understand." Marcus nodded, pulling up a global map on the room's display screen. Red dots marked locations across every continent. It's not just a proposal anymore. Thanks to Dr. Running Bear's research, we've identified 47 sites worldwide that show identical electromagnetic signatures to the Great Pyramid. Dr. Running Bear leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of generational knowledge. "My people have always known that certain places were different. We called them places where the earth speaks, the acoustic properties, the electromagnetic anomalies, the consciousness-altering effects. They're all documented in our oral traditions." She pointed to several dots in North America. Serpent Mound in Ohio, the Medicine Wheels of Wyoming, certain kivas in the southwest. They all show the same engineering principles, positioning at electromagnetic convergence points, internal geometries designed for acoustic resonance, materials chosen for their piezoelectric properties. Dr. Kozlov, who had been quietly analysing electromagnetic data, looked up with excitement. "I've been comparing the frequency patterns from these sites. They're not random, they form a harmonic sequence. Each site resonates at frequencies that complement the others, as if they were designed to work together as a single system." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. A single system spanning the entire globe. More than that, Dr. Kozlov continued, pulling up a complex waveform analysis. If all these sites were activated simultaneously, the combined electromagnetic output would create a standing wave pattern around the Earth. The planet itself would become a resonating chamber. The implications hung heavy in the room. Marcus thought back to his experience in the King's Chamber, the sense of connecting not just to the pyramid, but to something vast and worldwide. Had he been tapping into a dormant global network that once linked human consciousness across continents? Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "There's something else we need to consider. I've been analysing historical records of these sites, looking for patterns of suppression. It's remarkable how consistently ancient knowledge about these places has been discouraged." He brought up a timeline on his laptop. The Library of Alexandria burned multiple times, always targeting texts about natural philosophy and sacred geometry. The Spanish conquistadors systematically destroyed Mayan and Aztec codices that contained astronomical and architectural knowledge. The British Empire consistently relocated indigenous populations away from sites that showed electromagnetic anomalies. Dr. Running Bear's expression darkened. "My ancestors were forced from sacred sites across North America. The official reason was always agricultural development or mineral rights, but they consistently targeted places where consciousness-altering experiences were known to occur." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. The same pattern of suppression he'd encountered with the pyramid's hidden chambers was part of a much larger historical trend. Someone, or some group, had been systematically working for centuries to prevent humanity from rediscovering its technological and spiritual heritage. "The question is," Dr. Solomon said quietly, "what would happen if we reactivated this network?" Dr. Solomon's question haunted Marcus for days. The theoretical implications of reactivating an ancient global consciousness network were staggering, but the practical challenges seemed insurmountable. Most of the sites were under government control, protected by restricted access, or surrounded by modern development that would interfere with their electromagnetic properties. But Marcus couldn't let go of what he'd experienced in the King's Chamber. The sense of expanded awareness, of connection to something vast and ancient, had fundamentally changed his understanding of human potential. If that experience could be replicated and shared, it might represent the next stage of human evolution. The answer came from an unexpected source. Hassan appeared at Marcus's hotel room door early one morning, carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing an expression of nervous determination. "Doctor, Chen, my family, we have been guardians longer than we have been guides. My great-grandfather, before the British came, before the tourists, he was keeper of the old knowledge." Hassan opened the satchel to reveal documents that made Marcus's breath catch. Hand-drawn maps showing underground passages throughout the Giza Plateau. Detailed diagrams of the pyramid's internal structure, including chambers that weren't on any official archaeological survey, and most remarkably technical drawings that showed how the pyramid's systems could be manually activated. "The old knowledge, it was never lost completely," Hassan continued. "Hidden, yes. Dangerous to speak of, yes. But preserved by families like mine, waiting for someone who could understand its importance." The drawings revealed that the pyramid's consciousness-amplifying effects weren't automatic. They required specific activation procedures. Water had to be introduced into the subterranean chambers at precise volumes and timing. Certain crystals needed to be placed in the sealed chambers to focus the electromagnetic fields. And most crucially, multiple people had to participate simultaneously, their consciousness working together to achieve resonance with the global network. "Hassan, this is incredible, but how could we possibly implement it? We'd need access to the sealed chambers, permission for extended stays in the pyramid, and coordination with researchers at sites around the world." Hassan smiled, the expression of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. "Dr. Chen, who do you think has been maintaining the pyramid systems all these years? The tourist guides, the security staff, the maintenance workers, many of us are descendants of the original Guardians. We have been waiting for someone like you, someone who could understand what we have been protecting. Over the next few hours, Hassan revealed the existence of a network of Guardians at ancient sites worldwide. Families who had maintained the old knowledge for generations, keeping the sites minimally functional while waiting for the time when they could be fully reactivated. The suppression Marcus had encountered wasn't just from modern governments. It was part of an ancient conflict between those who sought to preserve transformative knowledge and those who feared its implications for existing power structures. But now, Hassan said, his eyes bright with possibility, the time of hiding is ending. The world is ready for the old wisdom to return. Marcus spent the next week in secret meetings with Hassan's network. They showed him hidden passages that connected the pyramids at Giza to underground chambers extending for kilometers beneath the desert. They revealed caches of ancient crystals and metallic components that could be used to restore the pyramid's full functionality. Most remarkably, they demonstrated that they had been maintaining contact with Guardian networks at other sites around the world, using methods that seemed to blend ancient wisdom with modern technology. The plan they developed was audacious beyond anything Marcus had imagined. On the night of the next new moon, when electromagnetic conditions would be optimal, Guardian networks at 12 major sites would simultaneously activate their monuments' consciousness-amplifying systems. The Great Pyramid would serve as the primary node, with Marcus and the research team providing scientific documentation of the process. If successful, the experiment would create the first coordinated activation of the global consciousness network in over 3,000 years. The effects, according to the Guardians' preserved knowledge, would be felt worldwide. A sudden expansion of human awareness that could fundamentally alter the course of civilization. But there were risks. The ancient texts spoke of individuals who had been unprepared for the experience, whose consciousness had been overwhelmed by the sudden expansion of awareness. There were warnings about the network attracting the attention of forces that had opposed its use in the past, and there was the very real possibility that modern governments would respond to the activation with force, viewing it as a threat to established order. As Marcus stood in the king's chamber 1 week before the planned activation, surrounded by crystals and metallic components that Hassan's people had been safeguarding for millennia, he realized that he was about to participate in either the most important experiment in human history or the most dangerous. The pyramid hummed around him with renewed energy, its systems responding to the presence of the missing components. Through his consciousness, he could sense the other sites coming online around the world, their guardians preparing for an event that would either herald humanity's next evolutionary leap or mark the end of the Age of Secrets forever. The night of the new moon arrived with unprecedented atmospheric conditions. Aurora activity extended far beyond the polar regions, creating shimmering curtains of light visible even in Egypt's desert sky. Electromagnetic storms disrupted satellite communications worldwide, while seismic monitoring stations detected subtle but synchronized vibrations from ancient sites across the globe. Marcus stood in the king's chamber surrounded by Hassan's Guardian network and the international research team. The chamber had been transformed. Crystalline structures now occupied the corners, their faceted surfaces catching and redirecting the subtle light from their instruments. Copper coils, fashioned according to ancient diagrams, had been positioned to enhance the room's natural electromagnetic properties. Most remarkably, water from the Nile's ancient flood channels had been carefully directed into the subterranean chambers, creating the hydraulic pressure needed to activate the pyramid's piezoelectric systems. Dr. Running Bear checked her communication device one final time. Serpent Mound is reporting full activation. The electromagnetic readings are unlike anything we've ever recorded. Dr. Morrison, monitoring from Newgrange and Ireland, transmitted similar reports. The acoustic resonance here is building beyond our measurement capabilities. The entire mound is vibrating in harmony with frequencies we didn't know existed. Around the world, Guardian networks at sites from Machu Picchu to Angkor Wat were reporting the same phenomenon. Ancient monuments that had been dormant for millennia were awakening. their consciousness-amplifying systems responding to coordinated activation for the first time in recorded history. In the King's Chamber, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of expanded awareness beginning to build, but this time it was different, stronger, more focused, and connected to something vast beyond individual consciousness. Through the electromagnetic field generated by the activated pyramid, he could sense the presence of people at the other sites, their awareness merging into a collective experience that transcended physical distance. Dr. Kozlov, monitoring the electromagnetic readings, whispered in amazement, "The standing wave pattern is forming exactly as predicted. The Earth's electromagnetic field is reorganizing itself around these sites." But the experience went beyond scientific measurement. As the network reached full activation, Marcus found his consciousness expanding not just across space but across time. He could sense the pyramid builders themselves, not as historical figures but as present awareness, as if their consciousness had been preserved within the structure itself, waiting for this moment of reactivation. The ancient Egyptians hadn't just built a machine for amplifying consciousness, they had created a means of preserving it across millennia. The pyramid was a library of human awareness, containing the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had achieved levels of understanding that modern science was only beginning to approach. Through the network, Marcus experienced visions of the ancient world as it had truly been. Not the primitive civilization described in history textbooks, but a global culture connected by consciousness-amplifying technology, capable of feats that seemed magical only because the principles had been forgotten. He saw the construction of the monuments not as slave labour directed by megalomaniacal pharaohs, but as collaborative projects undertaken by people who understood their role in maintaining humanity's connection to higher levels of awareness. Most remarkably, he experienced the reason why the network had been deactivated. As human civilizations became more hierarchical and centralized, the egalitarian consciousness expansion technology had been seen as a threat to emerging power structures. Rulers who depended on controlling information and limiting awareness had systematically dismantled the network, replacing consciousness-expanding wisdom traditions with belief systems that emphasized obedience and separation. The suppression hadn't been accidental. It had been deliberate, coordinated across cultures and centuries by those who understood that widespread access to expanded consciousness would make traditional forms of dominance impossible to maintain. But the network had been designed with safeguards. The consciousness of its builders had been preserved within the structures themselves, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its heritage. That time, Marcus realized, was now. As the activation reached its peak, effects began manifesting around the world. Dr. Running Bear reported that people living near the activated sites were spontaneously experiencing expanded states of consciousness. Emergency services were receiving calls about strange lights and telepathic experiences. Social media was flooded with reports of sudden insights, creative breakthroughs, and experiences of connection that transcended normal human limitations. But there was resistance as well. Military aircraft were scrambling towards several of the activated sites. Government communications were buzzing with references to unauthorized experiments and potential security threats. The same forces that had suppressed the ancient knowledge were mobilizing to contain its return. Hassan, who had been monitoring communications with Guardian networks worldwide, turned to Marcus with urgent concern. "Doctor, Chen, we have perhaps 30 minutes before official intervention begins. The network is fully activated, but maintaining it will require ongoing commitment from people around the world." Marcus understood. The ancient network hadn't been maintained by technology alone. It had required conscious participation from people who understood its importance. The reactivation was just the beginning. For the consciousness-expanding effects to continue, individuals at sites around the world would need to take responsibility for maintaining the system, despite inevitable opposition from established power structures. As sirens began wailing in the distance and the first military helicopters appeared on the horizon, Marcus made his final recordings. The scientific data would be crucial for documenting what had occurred, but the real proof would be the ongoing transformation of human consciousness that the network had initiated. The age of secrets was truly ending. But as Marcus and his team prepared to face the consequences of their world-changing experiment, he realized that the real work was just beginning. 6 months after the global awakening, as the media had dubbed it, Marcus sat in a small cafe in Prague, one of dozens of cities where consciousness research centres had spontaneously emerged. Around the world, people who had experienced the network activation had begun gathering, sharing their experiences, and developing new applications for expanded awareness. The official response had been predictable. Governments had classified the event as a coordinated hoax involving atmospheric anomalies and mass suggestion. The Guardian networks had been disbanded, the sites placed under increased security, and several researchers had found their careers and funding mysteriously terminated. But the consciousness genie was out of the bottle. Dr. Running Bear, now leading a consortium of indigenous researchers, had documented over 10,000 cases of enhanced psychic abilities manifesting in people who had been near activated sites. Dr. Kozlov was working with a network of physicists who had detected fundamental changes in quantum field behaviour around former network locations. Even Dr. Morrison, despite losing his university position, continued documenting the ongoing acoustic anomalies at ancient sites worldwide. Most remarkably, people were spontaneously rediscovering consciousness expansion techniques that had been lost for millennia. Meditation practices, acoustic healing methods, and electromagnetic sensitivity training were emerging independently in communities around the globe, as if the network activation had reawakened dormant human capabilities. Hassan had become something of a folk hero in Egypt, his family's guardianship role finally acknowledged by people who had experienced the pyramid's true power. Though official access remained restricted, underground tours of the pyramid's hidden systems had become a pilgrimage for those seeking direct experience of expanded consciousness. Marcus himself had changed profoundly. The night in the activated King's Chamber had left him with permanent access to expanded awareness states. He could sense the electromagnetic fields of other people, communicate telepathically with others who had experienced the network, and access information through methods that conventional science couldn't explain. But perhaps the most significant change was happening at a societal level. The consciousness expansion experienced by millions of people worldwide had created a generation less susceptible to manipulation, more capable of independent thinking, and naturally inclined toward cooperation rather than competition. Political movements based on fear and division were finding it increasingly difficult to gain traction. Economic systems that depended on artificial scarcity and manufactured desire were being replaced by resource-sharing networks organised through enhanced human communication abilities. The ancient pyramid builders' greatest achievement wasn't the monuments themselves, it was the civilization they had made possible. A society where expanded consciousness was the norm rather than the exception, where human potential was fully realised, and where technology served to enhance rather than replace natural human capabilities. As Marcus finished his coffee and prepared for another day of documenting the ongoing transformation, he reflected on the pyramid's true message. The structure itself had been important, but it was ultimately just a tool. The real power had always been within human consciousness itself, the capacity for awareness to expand, connect, and transcend the limitations that seemed so absolute. The pyramids had been built not to house the dead, but to awaken the living, and after 4,000 years of slumber, humanity was finally ready to reclaim its birthright. Standing in the Prague sunlight, Marcus could sense the presence of others around the world who had experienced the awakening. Through the invisible network that still connected activated sites, he felt their determination to ensure that the consciousness-expanding knowledge would never again be lost or suppressed. They told us the pyramids were tombs, but standing here, I know that's a lie. This wasn't built to bury the dead. It was built to keep the world alive, to preserve and transmit the highest potentials of human consciousness across the millennia, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its forgotten heritage. That time had finally come. The age of expanded consciousness had begun, and no force on earth could put the awakened human spirit back to sleep. The network hummed silently across the globe, connecting minds and hearts in ways that transcended physical distance. The ancient guardian's work was complete. The future of human consciousness stretched ahead like dawn breaking over the desert, infinite with possibility. Marcus smiled, feeling the pyramid's eternal presence in his consciousness, and stepped forward into humanity's transformed tomorrow.